Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. A village to save. What a mess this is, muttered Kisuk to himself as he dodged the claws of a nearby hollow. Arriving had been the easy part. The hard part was cleaving through all the hollows that surrounded the barrier, keeping the small village safe. They had only been at it for around 10 minutes, but the strain of fighting this many enemies at once in such small numbers was taking its toll on them all mentally. There simply was too many to clear away easily. The Genesis was doing a good job at bombarding the enemy from above, but its firepower was limited. It couldn't afford to use its miniature Etherian cannon either, with the state the barrier was in. With the way the barrier was flickering every few seconds, it was clear that even a glancing blow from a blast like that would tear open a hole. It was sheer luck that the hollows weren't here in greater force. Too much would have drawn attention, but too little would have provided little resistance to them. Baragan was playing this smart, it seemed. Avoiding a chunk of acid that sailed through the air towards him, his Zanpakuta slicing through the air in the process and tearing through another hollow's mask with little resistance, he raised a single finger towards the hollow that had tried to hit him, launching a small streak of blue lightning at it and letting the Kita pierce its mask. Both hollows faded away the instant the masks they wore were destroyed, allowing his attention to be focused back on all the remaining hollows. What he would give to just let Ichigo cut loose on all these hollows. His Bankai's power could have made short work of all of them. They weren't particularly strong after all, rather they were too numerous. But doing that would be like lighting a beacon announcing that he's away from the main battlefields and is preoccupied. That was something they could not allow to happen. Of course, Ichigo hadn't been too accepting of the idea to keep him locked away in the Genesis when he knew they would be facing such odds. Out of all of them, he would be the last to run out of magical power by far, plus the large-scale attacks he could pull out easily alongside his regeneration essentially made him a one-man army against a force this size. He just hoped the enemy wouldn't try and take advantage of that and try and force Ichigo to expend all his energy or overdo it. Ichigo had sworn to not use his Bankai no matter what unless a truly overwhelming foe appeared, and would likely hold himself to that oath even if he started struggling under the pressure. The best outcome would be to finish this all up before the hollows could try anything. Raising his blade up, he swung down and watched briefly as crimson energy sliced through the air, tearing into the ranks of the hollows before him. Another 20 minutes, maybe 30, and they would be done if the rate they would going was kept up. They were all clearing out a different area and eventually they would meet up with one another through fighting, and when that happened it would be clear that a significant amount of hollows in the area around them would have decreased as a result. Kisuk Urahara, is it? He paused after slicing through the last of the hollows surrounding him, glancing over his shoulder at the one hollow with far greater control of its magical power than the others. This one had been bothering him since it started observing him from the distance a few minutes back. Each moment had seen the hollow moving closer and closer until now it was almost within striking distance. If it was any other hollow he might have already struck by now. He had multiple low-level Kita spells at the forefront of his mind, their words just ready to be uttered or even skipped if he truly desired. He also had his Zanpakuta ready, Benihime just begging to be released and to bath in the blood of these hollows. He stayed his hand though. This hollow was an Arankar. It had not only been confident enough to approach him, without even drawing its sword, but it was also eyeing him with the same look he saw whenever he looked in a mirror during his work. But the main reason was because of one simple fact. It knew his name. Even with the war going on, even with the more public appearance he had begun to take, people still were not fully aware of who he was. He had disappeared for years when he left the Magic Council, fading away into obscurity. Some people might recognize him now from back then, but his look had changed too. His hat, as well as being a favorite of his, served its purpose well of aiding his new appearance's differences from his old self. For a hollow to know his name, it could only mean that it either had managed to find mention of him in old reports and newspapers and had managed to put the pieces together, something he deemed unlikely considering how isolated all these hollows must have been to hide for so long, or it knew about him for a more personal reason. Most of those people that knew him tended to be scientists or researchers, those that had followed him in quite a lot of depth when he had still been around or had done a lot of digging during the time he had been gone for. Either way though, a hollow knowing his name also carried one other implication. It knew enough just through that to deem him a threat to its life. Those that knew his name always tended to be tricky opponents. They weren't as easily fooled because they expected him to do the impossible, to perform techniques or act out plans that no one else would even dream of. They tended to realize any of the plans that he used always had backups to their backups, and that even their attempts at a surefire kill would not be guaranteed to work if he had the right counter prepared for that very situation. This paranoia would have been dangerous to have against anyone else. But not him. Never him. "So who are you?" he asked, laying the flat edge of his Zanpakuto against his shoulder in a show of laxness. Not even a flinch from the hollow. It wasn't falling for it. "It's unfair to hoard all the knowledge to yourself." The hollow smirked, one hand pressing against the bridge of the glasses he wore, a smirk across his face. "It's quite hypocritical of you to say such a thing, you realize. Say Laporo Grands, the seventh espada. I should at least award intellectual curiosity. It's something we share, you and I. Share with me." Kisuk chuckled his usual fake laugh, waving a hand in front of his face as he put up an act of silliness. "Little old me? I'm hardly much of a scientist. I just tinker with a few things I find interesting." "And to great depth," Laporo replied, not falling for any of Kisuk's attempts to make the hollow re-evaluate his opinion of him. "You truly are a dangerous man. I almost feel myself wanting to dismiss what I've heard now that I face you, but Ulquiorra was quite specific in that I should never underestimate you. But you know what?" added Laporo as his smirk widened in madness. "I half want to. Just so I can prove to you that your methods at stopping me will be fruitless." Grabbing his Zanpakuto with one hand, he pulled it from his sheath in a wide arc before letting it hover right above his lips as he tilted his head back. "But I'll do the right thing. I'll crush you immediately. Sip, Fornicaris." Taking a step back from the hollow as it released its resurrection, Kisuk eyed the storm of pink energy warily as it began to disperse, the nearby hollows backing away as Laporo's magical power finished rising. What he was greeted to wasn't quite what he expected, however. Laporo was still very much humanoid, though the white uniform he had been wearing before had been replaced with a layer-like dress for his lower half and a segmented form-fitting gray shirt for his top half, the sleeves white with what appeared to be purple droplets extending down from the sleeves. Those same droplets extended down from the edges of his layer-like dress along from the four gray branch-like structures that stretched out from his back, though those on the wings were a brighter red instead. The glasses had vanished too, replaced by a sort of headdress around the sides of the hollow's head, four purple lines going down the hollow's right eye. Nails had extended and turned the same shade of purple as the droplets. Whether they would be as sharp as a Zanpakuto was debatable, but Kisuk knew enough about resurrections to be wary anyway. "Awaken, Benihime," he stated quietly, allowing his Zanpakuto to take its Shikai state. Raising it quickly, he swung down, a crimson arc of energy flying through the air. "Nake, Benihime." Watching the arc of crimson energy lazily, Laporo willed his thin branch-like wings to close around him, the droplets hanging off them expanding and forming a barrier around himself for the attack to bounce harmlessly again. "Really?" Laporo asked as his wings unwrapped around him. "You thought a technique like that would work?" Kisuk said nothing, merely raising his blade in defense. "So be it." Letting loose a torrent of black liquid from his back, Laporo let it rain across the battlefield around them, Kisuk quickly bringing up his Zanpakuto to shield himself. Chikasumi no Tate. A blood-red shield, shaped as a hexagon, formed before him, covering his body from the droplets just in time. A few fell across his shield as he kept an eye on Laporo, but that focus was soon shifted to the hollows around him, those that had been touched by the droplets. From the droplets formed new enemies, identical to those that they had touched, and those copies wasted no time in charging at him. With the rain of pellets stopped, he moved his sword around, keeping the shield up as he let one of the first hollow clones strike pointlessly at his shield. "Kirisaki, Benihime," he said simply as pellets of energy flew out from the shield, tearing into the charging hollows. His other arm came up towards the other nearby pack of hollows, red light generating at his palm. "Hada number 31, Shakaha. Forgetting about me?" Laporo asked as he appeared on the other side of the shield as Kisuk turned his head away, slashing his nails down at the man's chest. They made contact for a brief moment as Kisuk fell backwards, hollows lunging at him from all sides. But before they could land a hit, he began to expand, blowing up like a balloon before finally popping, releasing a large explosion around himself that wiped out all the attacking hollows. Sailaporo stared at the sight in shock before looking around, spotting Kisuke a short distance away with his sword already swung down. The crimson energy had already been released, but the distance was more than sufficient enough for his wings to protect him. Pulling them in front of him, he formed a shield once more, letting the blast slam against them harmlessly. Is that really all the power? He never managed to finish his sentence as his wings unfolded, gurgling on the blood filling his throat as a blade sliced into his neck. Should have expected more, Kisuke said as he pulled his blade back out of the hollows next, the version of himself in the distance popping into smoke. Portable Gigas. The explosive variants are quite effective when I managed to pull the switch off well, and you foolishly gave me that opening when you hide your eyes from my first attack. Swiping out with his Zanpakuto, he severed the hollow's head from its body, leaving nothing to chance. Despite his fears, the fight had been easier than he expected. Using Kami-Sorai had also allowed him to set up that trap, as the amount of magic his remote clones could use was quite limited. They normally had just enough to use 2 of his Zanpakuto's abilities, and even then not to the extent he would like them to be. Combining the clones with his cloaks to dampen magical power though had caused the hollow to dance right across the palm of his hand. Back to the rest of you, he muttered as he turned to the rest of the hollows, now all charging towards him once again with the hollow they had been intimidated of dead. My job is never easy, is it? Protector of the Fairies. Blocking out the sounds of terror from behind him, Toshiro focused on the task before him, sitting down cross-legged with his Zanpakuto resting on his lap. One hand continued to rest on the blade's edge while the other continued to be stretched out towards the barrier in the distance. The actions served little use. He could cast this kito without any of this hassle and maintain it as such. But the villagers knew little about magic, and even explanations would only cover so much. So long as it looked like he was continuing to do something, they would at least have some faith that they would be kept safe and could believe he was putting everything he had into maintaining it. The latter was certainly true, but he had almost drifted off a few times. Sleep constantly threatened to overwhelming him, but the very actions he was using to fake action also served to give his mind something to latch onto and to force his mind to stay awake. It had worked though. It had worked long enough for him to be able to smile again at the sight of the Genesis appearing and at the fighting happening in the distance. He almost considered dropping the act, but he figured he could keep it going for a bit longer. So they did come. An old voice came from his right side, the old man that had been keeping him company since the start, speaking up for the first time in a while. I had my doubts your girlfriend could make it back safely, let alone in time too. Karen's strong, Toshiro replied, purposefully ignoring the girlfriend comment. He wondered if the fact he was slowly able to simply accept these comments meant he was starting to consider his and Karen's relationship to be the same that everyone else saw. She was always going to make it back. The old man chuckled. I can see that now. Still, I am a bit surprised, to be honest. I figured a Kurosaka would be more reluctant to help someone like me. Toshiro frowned. This wasn't the first time the old man had made such accusations. You say that like you did something they should hate you for. Perhaps I did, the man replied cryptically. Still, I am thankful for any help to arrive. I would have given up my own life to these monsters if it meant saving my people, so it is a great relief to me to see that they will be saved. We haven't won yet. But you will, I am confident in that. If a force like this wasn't enough, then they would have brought more. Toshiro couldn't deny the man's words. Even if the man wasn't aware of it, the Genesis held some of Ishgar's strongest mages. Enough to deal with a large force of weak hollows like this. Your people will be able to relax soon. In a few hours they might very well be safe and sound within the barrier. I do hope so, the old man muttered softly. I would so like to see it. Many of us have discussed what it looked like. Many of the others have described it as a pure and bright light, almost like a utopia. I wouldn't quite describe it like that, Toshiro reluctantly admitted. It's more of a birdcage if anything. The barrier keeps us in as much as it keeps the enemy out. And you think that would make a difference to use trapped outside? A cage is better than the hell we are in. Fair enough. Giving another glance to the barrier, He frowned as he noticed it flickering repeatedly once more. He was out of magic to push into it to stop that now. One solid hit from a strong attack would probably shatter it like glass and send the villagers into a panic, and he would not have the energy left to fight off more than a few hollows. Everyone is still accounted for. As far as we can tell, the old man replied, glancing back at the villagers and muttering numbers under his breath as he counted them out. Yep, still got everyone. No one has drifted away yet. Keep it that way. The people here listen to you and look for you for guidance. It's what made them believe in my barrier, and it's what made them believe they would be saved. If the barrier breaks, they cannot afford to try and run. I can only protect them for a while longer, and I cannot do that if they are spread out. I'll do my best, but I can hardly control them. Fear can make us throw reason out the window. Just do your best. You care about them far more than I do, so make sure to do what's necessary to keep them alive, Mr. Mayor. I always do, the old man replied softly, glancing out to the barrier as another large burst of energy impacted in the distance against the hollows. No matter what, I have to sacrifice to do so. Protector of the fairies. Slicing through the midst of hollows with both blades, rivers of blood following behind him, Ichigo continued his charge through the hollow army, his form mostly hidden by the cloak he was wearing. It had taken a lot of persuasion to get the others to risk letting him out, and this was one of the few conditions he had been forced to agree to. Visually it served to help hide his identity in case any hollows escaped and reported back, but the main purpose was solely to keep his power suppressed from any that might be able to sense it at this range. His attacks would still make noise, but at the very least it would be muddled up with all the other magic in the area, with the majority of his power hidden from sight. It had its limits though. If he dared to go beyond the level of power his Shikai had, then he would be in trouble. This cloak was good, but his Bankai simply released far too much energy to be dismissed as background noise by any sensor. Those thoughts never lingered long in his mind though. In the heat of battle, the option to use such power had been removed from his mind, his full focus on using what he had available at hand to survive through the mass amount of hollows surrounding him. Blades sliced through the air at incredible speeds, cleaving through hollows with single strikes and allowing him further progress into their midst. Projectiles of all kinds fired at him from all sides, many of the hollows not even afraid of catching their own allies in the crossfire. They all missed, hitting one another as he took to the skies briefly. Hollows met him up there, swarming at him from all sides in an attempt to close off his escape routes. His only response was to smirk, bright blue energy spiraling around the larger of his two blades before being released in one massive blast. Getchuga Tenshou. For hollows of this nature, little else was needed at times. Those that tried to close off the path ahead of him had nothing left of them when the smoke cleared, not that he had stayed to watch. He was already moving on to the next batch as he continued his charge through their forces. Ichigo, your targets are up ahead. Got it, Ichigo replied to Hibiki, slicing through another hollow as his eyes latched onto the large hill in the distance. The hollows are starting to thin out. I think they're wary of the hollows ahead. I share those sentiments, Hibiki muttered, a pause developing in the conversation as he glanced at screens on his end. The hollows seemed to stop at the hill's base, not a single one of them even present further up bar the two individuals up there. Both have a lot of power to them, so be careful. I will. Cutting off the connection, Ichigo cleared the last of the hollows as he reached the hill's base, sprinting up it with haste. Both blades continued to hang tightly by his sides, ready to swing at a moment's notice when the hollows ahead inevitably came into view. He wasn't sure if they knew it was him or not, but the suddenly release of power ahead of himself immediately informed him that they weren't even going to be playing around. That kind of power could only mean they had already released their resurrections. Immediately he noticed the figure rushing towards him. Dressing the familiar attire of other errand cars for the most part, the top half of his body was left bare, exposing his chest in a set of 4 arms, each arm covered in the same bone-white structure that a hollow's mask always appeared to be made of. A set of horns were situated on his head, forming a crescent moon shape from their appearance, with the left horn being far longer than the right, while his hair flowed freely around his head, mostly covering a patch of mask that stuck out over his left eye. The odd part about the hollow though was the massive hole in its chest, covering almost half of its mass. Ichigo's focus latched onto the 4 massive weapons the hollow wielded more than anything else though. Each was comparably to a double-headed scythe, seeming far too heavy to be used by any normal human, but was being swung down at him like a toy with one hand by this hollow. "It's you!" screamed the hollow, almost in desperation, as it brought all four scythes down on Ichigo's head. Or at least that had been its intention. Instead, Ichigo brought up the larger of his two blades in response, putting his full force into it and swinging fast enough that the air pressure released knocked the hollow back a tiny bit, the blades slicing through the air instead and slamming into the ground between the two. Without pausing to give the hollow time to recover, Ichigo lunged in with his other blade, aiming for the hollow's throat as he sliced out with the blade. The hollow was fast though. Fast enough to recover just in time to bring up one of its four scythes to block the blow with. The weapon however cracked on contact, the point of which Ichigo's Zanpakuto hit, leaving a spider web pattern of cracks along the metal. Sticking out its tongue, the hollow's eyes shined with the same desperation it had shown in its voice. At the tip of the tongue a golden zero immediately sprung to life, being released at point-blank range. It was about to slam into Ichigo when he brought back the smaller of his two blades and put in between him and the hollow's attack, the point aimed directly at the blast. Absorb. No other words were needed to be said. The zero slammed against the blade and vanished, all the energy being drawn into the blade itself and leaving a layer of golden energy around the blade. Immediately Ichigo raised the blade back up, pointing the tip towards the sky. "You can have this back." Swinging down without any hesitation, Ichigo simply watched as he launched the full energy of the zero right back at the hollow, his own energy making it stronger than ever before. Just as he had little room to dodge, so did the hollow before him, bringing up all four scythes in a vague form of defense against the attack before it could hit. Eyes warily watching the smoke released as the attack exploded against the hollow, Ichigo kept both blades ready, his mind forcing himself to remember that there was still one more hollow here that had not made a move. What was it waiting for? It must have realized by now that this hollow would not win on its own. As the smoke cleared, it became apparent that the hollow had thrown everything it could to block and that it still hadn't been enough. All four of its scythes were shattered at its feet, its armor on its arms broken in multiple areas. Its hair had been blown back and thrown wild around its head, while a small gash stretched from its left shoulder down to its waist, barely bleeding. Something felt odd about this situation though. He watched as the hollow took deep breaths, its skin rapidly repairing itself with instant regeneration. The only reason he hadn't made a move during that moment was the confusion he felt. "You're afraid," Ichigo stated, the hollow before him flinching. That was it. The hollow tried to hide it, but he could see it in its eyes and its voice. When it had first seen him, it had shouted out at him. But still, something was odd. Those first words, they had been screamed in desperation more than anything left. "But not of me," he tagged on, his eyes drifting away from the hollow as he glanced around the battlefield. "I'm meant to be your salvation, I would reckon. Or rather my death is. Figured that out all by yourself," sneered the hollow, flexing all its wrists as it discarded the remains it still held of its broken scythes. From his wrists shot out new weapons, the poles extending out to their full lengths before the blades shot out of the ends. "Of course there is no way I could be afraid of you. There's a monster far more terrifying than you could ever be. Now die." Ichigo shook his head as the hollow shot towards him, a flicker of annoyance shooting through his mind. "I expected traps, but this is just annoying." "What did you say?" Swiping out with two scythes, the hollow attempted to slice through Ichigo from one side. Bringing a blade up in further annoyance, Ichigo held it steady beside him, holding the two scythes back easily. Annoyed that he couldn't even force Ichigo to move, the hollow swung his other two scythes round from the other side only for Ichigo to step back, manipulating his blade to allow the other scythes to slam against their copies. As quickly as he stepped back, he lunged back in, sidestepping around the scythes and severing all four arms in one swift motion. This time not giving the hollow time to recover as it tried to back away to regenerate, Ichigo pushed further forward, raising his smaller blade up high as he stepped in close. In a last-ditch effort, the hollow stepped forward too, a hidden pair of arms revealing themselves as they shot forward towards Ichigo's chest. Rather than stepping back, Ichigo simply moved faster, twisting his body as he slipped past the arms and slicing down at the hollow as he passed. To its credit, it managed to dodge the blow's initial target with its actions, the strike missing its neck and forced to instead gash across its head, cutting off the larger of its town horns and leaving a broken stub behind. The hollow tried to spin round to launch some semblance of counter, but Ichigo put that to a stop the moment his hand pressed against the hollow's leg, crimson energy building up instantly beneath his fingers. Zero. The crimson beam tore a hole straight through the hollow's leg, a large bloody mess forming as it wiped away all flesh and left nothing behind. The hollow screamed as it fell to the ground, its new arms slamming against the ground just in time to stop itself falling face first into the dirt. Damn you! The hollow screamed. I'll kill you. I will. That's what annoys me, Ichigo replied as he looked down at the hollow. Baragan had the nerve to tell you that you could win against me. That was cruel of him. Whatever you are trying to obtain, whatever goal you are desperately reaching towards, he gave you an impossible task to achieve to reach it. No matter how much you try, you can't kill me. I'm sorry, but that hope you are looking for is impossible to reach. Damn it. Wonder Weiss. Wonder Weiss. Ichigo frowned at the name. He would have continued to if not for the sudden pain that shot through his chest, blood catching in his throat as an arm pieced straight through his chest from behind. Eyes widening, he glanced back over his shoulder quickly, slashing out as he did so with the larger blade of Zanjutsu. A small hand came down to rest on his blade as it came close, Zanjutsu shattering in his hands before it could reach the new arrival. The hollow he came face to face with looked like a kid for the most part, perhaps 13 if he was to put it in human terms. Light blonde hair parted around the hollow's head, its mask forming a three-point tiara on the top of its head. Across its back was a large broadsword with a purple hilt, but the way the hollow was seemed to make him feel like it was almost there as a decoration. The hollow's expression, while cruel, was far too childlike. Especially when compared to every other hollow he had seen. The moment the hollow's expression began to change, he lunged into action. Pulling his body off the hollow's arm, he shot away, quickly putting some distance between the two of them as his wound began to close. Immediately the hollow vanished from his sensors, its level of skill with Sonido surprising him. He was familiar with how effective Sonido was at bypassing the senses of others, but he hadn't experienced it like this from any other hollow. It explained how it had snuck up on him. However, now that he knew it was here, his eyes could track it easily, allowing him to dodge the stab it made with its arm again. As he held his empty hand back, he allowed energy to gather and shape once more, reforming the larger form of Zanjutsu that had been destroyed. He had known the second that the blade had shattered that it had not been a result of magic barrier particles, which meant it would only take a moment to fully recreate his Zanpakuto again and then swipe out with both blades. But as he swung out with the reconstructed weapon, it met the same fate, shattering in his hand the moment it touched the hollow's skin. The hollow he assumed was this Wonder Weiss that the other hollow had called for looked at its side oddly, as if surprised it hadn't been harmed. He shared Wonder Weiss's sentiments. His blade had hit its exposed body this time, purposefully avoiding the hollow's hands in case the power that shattered his blade was based there. But he knew now it wasn't. For some reason his blade was shattering upon contact with the hollow, not even damaging it. Well, that wasn't quite all true. He could see the small gash he had left in the hollow's other side from his smaller blade. That blade wasn't even damaged at all either. And judging by the hollow's reaction, it didn't seem like it was an intentional use of its power. Perhaps it was more like a natural instinct. But then why only block one blade, not both, unless... My hollow powers, Ichigo muttered, glancing at the hollow more warily now. There was only one difference between his two blades. The larger blade held the essence of his hollow powers, while the smaller blade held the essence of his Quincy powers. If the hollow had been targeting his Shinigami powers, then both blades would have been affected, but they weren't. And with only one blade damaged, there was only one conclusion he could make. But... what are you? He asked. There was something odd about the fact it could do this. Hollows generally developed abilities upon their transformation. Over time they would evolve and reach new heights, but, like with Shinigami powers, they never truly deviated completely from their roots. So why would a hollow, upon its creation, have a power that would enable it to neutralize the powers of other hollows? It wouldn't have had any need to gain such an ability at its beginning. That left only one worrying thought. If it wasn't born with it, had it obtained it? And if so, at what point? As he watched the hollow, he noticed how its gaze seemed to shift around fairly often, as if getting distracted by everything around them. He couldn't see the hollow itself playing a part in gaining this power. It simply lacked the intelligence from what he could see. So did that mean it was forcefully given this ability? And if so, by who? And why? Letting his eyes shift away from Wonder Weiss for a brief moment, he eyed the original hollow he had faced, the hollow in the process of rearming itself once more now that all its wounds were healed. So who made him? He asked, his suspicions proving somewhat correct when he saw the hollow shrug. No idea. Probably say a Laporo if I had to guess. The guy's terribly weak, so weak he died far quicker than I thought he even would, but I can't deny he's smarter than I am. But rest assured, this hollow won't be killing you. I, Neutra Gilga, will. Still on about that? Ichigo asked in annoyance. You won't be able to. I'm more wary of Wonder Weiss there than you, and look at him. As if proving his point, Ichigo waved his free hand at the hollow in question. Wonder Weiss currently crouched down and pressing his face against the ground as he eyed a single flower that he had found. You're weaker than him. And you're weaker than me. Far weaker. Say that again, Neutra growled out in anger. I dare you to say dash. Weaker, interrupted Ichigo. You're weaker. It's foolish to not realize it. Frowning slightly, Ichigo glanced at the hollow more intently. Though your magical power is a bit odd, I'll give you that. It's almost a copy of Baragan's. It's not, Mavis spoke from his shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Neutra. I can sense a large application of time magic coming from him, but he's not the one using it. That magic isn't a copy. It's not a copy. Ichigo's eyes snapped back at the hollow in realization, staring at the overly large hole in its chest. That's not a hollow hole, is it? This. Neutra scowled, shaking his head. Motivation. Punishment. Call it what you will, this is what I have hovering over my neck like a guillotine. If I don't kill you, I'll be reduced to nothing but bones. So that was what it was. The odd feeling of magic he was sensing from Neutra wasn't its own power but whatever spell Baragan had cast on it. And because the magic being supplied to the spell was so large, he had assumed it was the hollow's own when in actual fact it was the weaker source of energy that belonged to the hollow before him. Once again he felt a float of anger flow through him in the face of it all. Baragan really did not even value those following him if he had punished this hollow this harshly. This wasn't a trial but an execution, and he was the executioner. Protector of the fairies. Why do I have to be stuck with you? Mest asked out loud, dodging underneath the swipe of a hollow's claws before slicing up with his scythe. The skin of the hollow may have been hard, but his scythe still cut through it like butter, cleaving through the neck and causing the head to go flying off its body. Letting the scythe continue through on its arc, he let the blade slam into the ground before flipping over the weapon, avoiding the attack of another hollow as his feet came to rest on the pole of the weapon. I mean, there would have been far better choices for me to team up with. If you think you are strong enough to fight armies like this alone, then feel free to break away from me, replied Hades, slamming his staff against the ground as he generated a large magic circle above his head, aiming directly at the sprinting crowds of hollows. From it fired hundreds of small shards of ice, bombarding the hollows in rapid succession. No one is forcing you to keep watch on me here. You could have always spoken up and asked to be with someone else. Mest grumbled back in response, pulling his weapon free as he dropped down to the ground and sliced up, taking out another hollow in his path. As much as he hated to admit it, Hades had a point. If it was a small group or a one-on-one battle, he never felt too lacking in his skills. True, some enemies might be far beyond his capabilities, but generally he knew how to compensate so long as they weren't overwhelmingly stronger like Blue Note had been. He was skilled and wouldn't let anyone deny that. Unfortunately, that in itself was the problem. He was skilled, but he was also specialized. People would be hard-pressed to find an infiltrator better than he was, his skill with his teleportation magic top class. And his memory manipulation was powerful enough that he had even been able to seal away his own memories and create a false life where he had become Doran Bolt. But all of that meant he was lacking in sustained battle, finding it difficult to deal with endless foes like this. He could manage if he had allies to watch his back, at least for a time, but in the future he had always been the first to retreat, running out of magic far before anyone else did. Today would be no different, he reckoned. He could use his teleportation magic for quite a while, but in a battle like this he would have to constantly teleport if he began using it, jumping between foes to get the best use out of it. It was stuff like this that made him a bit envious of people like Hades as he watched the Dark Mage let loose another powerful burst of magic, this time the magic being a form of earth manipulation that caused waves of rock to burst from the ground and crush the nearby hollows. Despite the big show of magic, however, he knew Hades would still be fighting long after he would have to retire. Levels of magical power like this made him both afraid and envious. The sound of a roar snapped him out of his thoughts, a particularly monstrous hollow almost getting the drop on him. Both of its massive fists intended to slam down on him, no room left for him to dodge to, when he vanished from sight. It was times like this at least that he could be thankful for his specialization. No matter how trapped he might look, he could always count on his teleportation magic to get him out of it. Eyeing the hollow as he reappeared on its bent back, he gave it a nod of satisfactory before raising his scythe. Slicing down, the blade cut clean through like always. Unlike before though, it left no wound behind, despite cutting cleanly through the hollow's body. Carefully leaping down from the hollow's back, he turned to face the other hollows lunging at him before snapping his fingers. The effect was instantaneous. From behind him the monstrous hollow lunged at its former allies, swatting them away like flies before letting loose a large roar. He had been waiting for a hollow like this to appear. Generally manipulating the memories of others was far more magic-intensive than his teleportation magic, or at least it was when he wanted to do anything serious with their minds. His scythe only made the process easier to do and faster, not cheaper. That meant he could only do something like this a limited number of times in battle and had to choose his targets carefully. It was also why he did like creatures like this as enemies. Any hollow below the Minos level was far simpler in its nature. They were creatures of instinct, still trying to regain their full reason. Even the levels of consciousness they had in these early stages were lacking in some regards when compared to normal humans or the Minos stages. Because of that, it was child's play to wipe out what little remained and replace their thoughts with ones more attuned to his own purposes. Stuff like protect me, fight for me or even die for me were some of his favorites to use for disposal soldiers like these. It seemed he had chosen well this time too, he noted as he watched the hollow crush another smaller group of hollows with its monstrous strength. Feeling happy to leave his new ally to deal with the hollows coming from there for a time, he returned his focus to the rest of the hollows, just in time to dodge a hollow that had gotten far too close in the fight's pause. Slicing through it and killing it with a single blow, he threw himself into the fray once more, trying to ignore the sounds he could hear coming from Hades. They sounded a lot like approval of the magic he had cast. "You truly are a ruthless one, aren't you?" Hades called out, Mest finally taking note of the man's words enough to respond. "Are you sure you're a fairy tale mage? Weren't you once too?" Mest replied coldly. "I do what's necessary. That's all." "How true. Still, you would do well if you desired to follow a path not approved by the world. Tell me, can you break more complex beings? Can you twist their heartstrings until they live only for you and obey your every whim?" "I'm going back to ignoring you now," Mest stated, ignoring the amused laughter coming from Hades once again. He hated how close those words hit home. He hated it because he knew he could do exactly what Hades was asking and had done so in the future. They had been enemies all the same, but what he could do didn't always make him feel happy with himself after it was done. "Look out." He zoned back into Hades' words just in time to respond, vanishing from sight just as a set of 4 spiked tentacles stabbed straight into the ground where he had been standing. Reappearing far above the forces in the sky for a brief moment, he glanced at where the attack had come from before teleporting away once again, this time to Hades' side. "2 hollows," he spoke quietly. "One looks like they already released their resurrection. The other looks like it's about to." "I'll deal with the one that just attacked," Hades stated. "I can deal with ranged combat just as easily as any other. You focus on forcing the other hollow to engage you on the ground or, failing that, keep the other hollows around us off my back till I can deal with both of them. Sound good?" "Fine with me," Mest replied, his annoyance at teaming up with Hades fading away for the time being. He could go back to hating the man afterwards. For now, he was an ally just like those he converted. Now wasn't the time for his petty views. Protector of the Fairies. The strength of a lazy hollow. Letting out a large yawn, the hollow known as Coyote Starkey glanced up from his lazy position on the ground, watching Mistoggen fighting off the mass amount of hollows he had ordered to engage him for him. From the look of it there were almost none left, the mage having made quick work of them for the most part. It had barely been 5 minutes, so he hadn't even had a chance to settle in for a brief nap, and from how it looked it was unlikely he would be able to do that any time soon either. Why can't I just be left to nap in peace? He asked himself as he got to his feet, covering his mouth with one hand as he let out another yawn. Just great. Waiting until Mistoggen was finally done with the hollows he had sent, he began to walk towards the mage lazily. There was no point rushing, and his very presence would make the man halt, hesitant to approach for a few moments. The longer he could delay fighting the better. I had hoped you would have taken longer, he stated as he got into hearing range. Lilynette wouldn't stop pestering me last night, so I barely got any sleep. I'm too tired for this mess. Then leave, Mistoggen replied coldly. No one is stopping you. Starkey actually stopped at the thought, holding his chin as he considered the idea for a brief moment. I would love to, he admitted. This whole war is a mess, and if I could I would have stayed out of it entirely. Unfortunately no hollow can say no to Lord Barrigan, so I have no choice but to fight if I want to live. It's a shame really. I would have loved to simply sleep in peace somewhere. He shook his head as he got rid of those thoughts, turning to face Mistoggen with slightly more focus than before. Resting his hand against the hilt of his sword for a moment, he debated not drawing it and taking the fight easy before realizing his opponent was unlikely to let that happen. Sighing, he reluctantly drew the blade, bringing it to the ready. He wouldn't want to try and block that spear Mistoggen was using with his bare hands. As he prepared to take a step forward though, he paused as an idea crossed his mind. Hey, what if we both just take it easy? Huh? He could see the confusion of Mistoggen's face, surprised that he was even trying to reason with him. What on earth are you talking about? I'm saying we just pretend to fight seriously. We throw in some glancing blows here and there, but don't go too far or do too much. Fighting me will keep the hollows off your back, so you can always leave it to your friends if you want. I'm sure they have enough firepower without you, and I get to relax a bit. It's a win-win for everyone. I honestly can't believe you're suggesting this, muttered Mistoggen. No. I won't take it easy, as you seem to want to. This is a battle in a war. I don't have the liberty of doing such a thing when my friends and allies are giving it their all. I see, Starkey replied in disappointment. A shame. In an instant he was on his enemy, Mistoggen hastily bringing up his spear to block the overhead strike. Looks like I will actually have to do some work today. Protector of the Fairies. Despite his best attempts at shaking off his enemies for a brief moment, Ichigo could gain no reprieve from them. Neutra and Wonder Weiss were unrelenting, viciously chasing after their quarry with a fervor only hollows possessed. Retreating too far away was unacceptable. Now was not a time to run, but neither could he afford to stand too close to them. But while Neutra's speed was easy to overcome, Wonder Weiss's was another matter entirely. The hollow was fast. It still wasn't as fast as he was, but it was close, even improving as the fight dragged on. It was almost like the hollow was unused to its own speed, and the more it used it the more deadly it became. With each passing second, time to pause and analyze the situation diminished. The faster Wonder Weiss got, the less time that was left available for the larger blade of his Zanpakuta to recover. It was getting harder and harder to hit Wonder Weiss with his smaller blade too, since it would purposefully throw itself towards his right side. Any other enemy could have been knocked back with his larger blade, but the enemy's ability was creating a hole in his guard that only this hollow could exploit. Rushing back away from the hollow from their latest encounter, his blade shattering in his right hand until nothing remained, he prepared to regenerate the blade only to sense the sudden build-up of magical power coming from behind him. His eyes flickering towards the source as he glanced over his shoulder, giving him a brief glimpse of the charging of a yellow Zero before it fired. Then there was nothing but a beam of destructive energy taking up half his vision. It would be easy to absorb this attack with the blade he had in his left hand. It would be easy to spin around and take the attack for himself and then fire it right back. But to do that meant turning his back to Wonder Weiss, and if he did that he knew the hollow wouldn't be afraid to take advantage of the opportunity. It wouldn't do it out of any kind of rational ideas it might have, it would just be its instincts guiding it to ensure its survival. So instead he kicked off lightly from the ground, flipping over in midair as he avoided the Zero's grasp by an inch. At the same time he aimed out with his free hand, his palm pointing towards Wonder Weiss, who had jumped in at the chance it had seen. Hada number 33, Sukatsui. Pale blue light burst forth from his palm, the destructive energy expanding into a wave of blue flames that tore across the sky. Rather than retreating like most, Wonder Weiss instead kept charging, the flames right on top of him before he did something Ichigo couldn't have expected. He screamed. It wasn't like Acknowledge's roar. That had carried power and strength with every sound it made. This was more like a screech, a piercing noise that was almost deafening to hear. It didn't hold any kind of strength to it, but the power was the same. The flames parted before Wonder Weiss, as if the sound waves themselves had parted the energy before him, and it was through that widening gap that Wonder Weiss leapt through. One hand was stretched out towards Ichigo, his fingers pressed tightly together as red energy danced along his fingertips. Before it could even try and release its technique, it was pinned to the ground, blades of all sizes slamming into its back and limbs and holding it down tightly. Sparing a glance at Wonder Weiss for just a brief moment to confirm it was trapped currently, Ichigo turned his attention back to Neutra, just in time to see the hollow leaping at him from behind just as the last of the Zero's energy began to dissipate. It hadn't been much of a surprise to see that Neutra's third pair of arms could also create a set of scythes for them, nor did it make him massively more dangerous than before. With 6 scythes slicing from 6 different angles towards him, a weaker person might have faltered and fallen back. But to him the weapons might as well have been moving in slow motion for all the good it did Neutra. Instead of falling back, Ichigo held his position in the air, only a few meters off the ground, and sliced out with his small blade, energy coating the energy. Releasing it instantly on contact, he blew away the scythe and the arm holding it, opening up a path in the attack that he quickly slipped through just as the rest of the blades finished slicing at him. The sound of metal hitting one another filled the air while Neutra's eyes glowed with increased frustration, releasing all 5 of his remaining blades and summoning up new blades as he began to spin around in the air. It had learned fairly often in this fight that his weapons would slow him down too much in situations like this, and that even a half-constructed weapon was better than nothing if it meant actually turning in time. Rather than tearing through Neutra's back, Ichigo's blade met half-formed steel, shattering the unfinished weapon and cutting down into Neutra's top 2 left arms. While the wound was deep, it was no problem for Neutra as his instant regeneration kicked in, the wound closing up before much blood could be spilt. Ichigo scowled as he pulled back a few steps, opening his right palm wide as a familiar weight began to reform in it. Gripping the blade tightly as the handle finished forming, he prepared for his next move. Despite how much stronger he was against Neutra, he couldn't deny the natural battle instincts that the hollow had. It was smart enough to know how to fight him to the best of its ability, including making the most out of its instant regeneration. However, the real problem came from himself. He kept lacking the reach with his Zanpakuto. His larger blade wasn't a problem, it could not only cut through the scythes if he put his full force into it but also through Neutra himself. But his smaller blade was another matter entirely. Its cutting power couldn't lose to his larger blade, but reach was another problem. Cutting through the scythes was easy, but Neutra was smart enough to position his guard carefully, keeping his weapons just far enough away from his body to ensure no fatal injuries could be caused when they inevitably failed him. Wonder Weiss was the key to this whole strategy. Glancing back at the hollow, careful to still keep one watchful eye on Neutra, he noticed that Wonder Weiss wasn't even struggling or trying to break free. It was just lying there still, its childlike eyes watching him like he was some toy it was playing with. Despite the unease he felt around the hollow, he could feel safe in the fact that for the moment it was not doing anything. Until it moved again, he could focus most of his attention on Neutra. So long as it was pinned to the ground over there, the larger blade of his Zanpakuto would be free to use. Preparing to rush in at Neutra, he began to turn away his attention from Wonder Weiss when it suddenly screamed. It was just like before in a lot of sense, with just one major difference. It was louder. The scream continued past him and spread across the battlefield, the barrier in the distance protecting the city even beginning to waver under the noise. The blades pinning Wonder Weiss down never stood a chance. They were brittle constructs as it was, and if the barrier could barely stand against the sound, then they stood no chance. They shattered where they stood, shards flying everything. Neither Ichigo nor Neutra let the shards flying at them both hit them, each raising a large weapon towards the source and using it as a momentary shield. Wonder Weiss, however, had no such defense, some of the shards embedding themselves in his back as they scattered all around him. As if pulled up by strings, Wonder Weiss got to his feet, ignoring the multiple sword wounds on his arms, legs and back. Blood was pooling around him, but he didn't care in the slightest, his eyes still locked on Ichigo himself. "Oh crap," Neutra muttered. "He snapped." "He can snap?" Ichigo asked, glancing at Neutra for a brief moment. That was his mistake. As his gaze shifted away, his eyes barely managed to pick up the small movement in the corner of his vision, and by that point it was too late to try and reach Wonder Weiss. Reaching up to its sword with one of its small hands, it began trying to pull it from its sheath, all the while making a small screeching sound. While the words were indistinguishable, their meaning was clear as Wonder Weiss's magical power began to skyrocket. Resurrection. Protector of the Fairies. Keeping his meteor spell running at full strength, Mistoggen darted back through the air as fast as he could, the Aaron-car he was facing hot on his heels. Despite his best attempts at getting away to put some space between the two of them, Stark-A was faster. Another fast strike shot towards him from his left side, barely giving him enough time to deflect the blow. This hollow wasn't giving him time to recover. If a spear had any weakness, it was that it was difficult to use if your opponent was already past your guard. It was meant to try and keep them at an appropriate distance and to strike quickly with. But currently he wasn't able to get a hit in, having to give it his all just to block the rain of blows. None of them though held a single bit of killing intent behind them. It was like Stark-A was going through the motions, uncaring of the end result and just trying to do his duty. The hollow wasn't really aiming to kill him, even if that happened it would benefit its cause. It just wanted it all to be over so it could go back to sleep. It seemed to really be as simple as that. The worst part was that right now even actions as empty as this were keeping him in check. Despite how Stark-A might be acting, it appeared he knew what to do to keep the battle in this state. If he could break away for long enough, then he could use his light make magic or release a heavenly body spell. Any attempts currently were either stopped in their tracks or forced to be halted in order to block a fast strike meant to force him to stop. Just let me do it. I won't even need to back away. Then there was the pest once again. Jelal had been noisy enough since he first let him loose, but ever since he had fought Blue Note and given in temporarily, Jelal had begun to appear more and more often in his mind. His actions were still all his own, but the man's voice would continue to pop up to voice his own opinion fairly often. And when he fought, he always heard the same offer again and again, even if the wording of it changed. Let me loose. Free me. It all equated to the same. Jelal would tempt him every time the fight turned even the slightest bit difficult, promising to end it quickly here and then. And if it wasn't for the vast difference in skill between the two of them, he would have doubted his words. If Jelal was weak, then the temptation would never have been this strong. It was like a drug. If he was Jelal, then he could crush any enemy he faced, his belief in that was absolute. While he might fear the man, he could at least respect the power he held. Admittedly, it was both of their power, but while he was clumsily making his work, Jelal was building masterpieces with it. It was the reality of the situation. However, relying on Jelal also would speed up his deterioration. Every time he let Jelal loose, the man's consciousness would completely invade him, and the more that happened, the more their body would come to accept Jelal as its host. Even if he did nothing, it was only a matter of time, but even a single use of Jelal could cut weeks off the time he had left. He didn't even want to think how much time he had lost during his fight with Blue Note and how much he must have accelerated his own destruction. He couldn't use him. Not for something as simple as this. So instead he gripped his spear tightly, the very symbol of his search for strength of his own, and poured his magic through the weapon. Then, with one swift movement, he chucked the spear forward as he continued to back away. He could see the confusion in his enemy's eyes clearly. While Stark-A had been ready for some form of retaliation like always, he doubted the Hollow had ever expected this. He had essentially thrown away his only weapon and was now exposed. And as he expected, Stark-A still moved in and sliced down at him. Barely dodging out of the way, he flicked his wrist, a burst of magic being transmitted to his spear. Immediately the hastily thrown projectile halted in its downward fall, spinning in the air before the point was aimed directly at the two of them. Just like a shooting star, it shot towards them as a beam of light, Starkey realizing at the last moment the danger coming from behind him. He dodged, but the action put him that little bit too far from Mistoggen, finally creating the distance Mistoggen had been desperately trying to gain. Grabbing the spear from the air as it reached him, Mistoggen poured his magic into both it and his meteor spell, forcing the golden aura around both to expand. "Your legendary spell?" he heard the Hollow ask. And was that hesitation he heard in the Hollow's voice? It probably didn't want to release more power than it was already releasing if he was being honest. Already using that? He shook his head. That wasn't what this was. His legendary spell was powerful, but maintaining it was so costly, and large-scale destruction like what happened to it by Blue Note really stressed his reserves. But neither could he completely abandon it too, since its strength was invaluable. So in the past month he had trained his magic to make a compromise. The aura around him solidified, forming plates and armor that began to cover his body in a streamlined manner. He couldn't afford to lose speed here, but neither could he abandon defense. So by shaping his light make magic like he did to form his legendary spell, and like how he did to enhance his spear, he would do the same around his body. Light make, armament. The light around his spear took on a similar trait, enhancing the force around both ends while shaping light into sharp points at both ends too. He even went as far to sharpen the light around the shaft of the weapon, the only dull areas being where he was touching and where he would touch. There was no doubt his enemy would continue to pressure him, and at close range too. So the only answer was to make sure he could take some hits while also enhancing his ability to hit. "My move," he muttered confidently, taking a step forward in the air. That confidence was almost shattered when Starkey reappeared right in front of him, was again swinging downward with his sword. His free arm came up just in time, the armor almost cracking under the blade but still holding strong enough to take the blow. Instantly he swung out with his spear, not caring what part of it hit his enemy. Simply a swipe would be good enough now that the entire weapon was sharpened. Starkey didn't take the chance to let himself get hit, backing away right before it could hit him. Not passing up the chance, Mistoggen released his spear with one hand and grabbed it with the other, immediately stabbing forward with the back end and using the sharp light as a spear's point. Starkey tried to take a step back, but he didn't let him escape, the light instantly stretching forward as he focused the energy around the spear into that single point. It was obvious Starkey hadn't expected such a thing, so when the spear's length expanded to twice its normal length, he almost found himself impaled on its end. His sword came up just in time, knocking the spear's point out of the way and instead leaving it to graze his cheek as it passed. In that instant the light immediately shrunk back down, Mistoggen spinning the spear back around as he pressed his charge and thrusting forward with the spear's true point. He could finally smile. The game of cat and mouse had finally been reversed, and now he was the one pressing back, keeping the Hollow in check. And now that he had the advantage, he refused to give it up. Stab after stab, slash after slash, he continued to manipulate the light around his weapon whenever it suited him best. Sometimes the whole weapon was sharpened, sometimes all that deadly power was focused in a single point. At one point Starkey had tried to block his strikes with the flat side of his sword, hoping to deflect them slightly, but had switched entirely to batting them out of the way after seeing how a single hit had cracked the blade. The fight wasn't anywhere near over yet though. Despite having the advantage currently, Mistoggen couldn't stop the few strikes that rained down on him. For every 4 strikes he made at the Hollow, he was forced to endure 1 in return. In a few cases he could have easily dodged back away. But he knew if he retreated for even a fraction of a second, then Starkey would reverse the situation once again. With each hit his armor cracked, the damage remaining for just a brief moment before his magic fixed the damaged armor of light with new energy. Each hit was definitely getting stronger though, as if the Hollow was testing how much damage his armor could take, and it would only be a matter of time before the armor itself wouldn't be enough alone. "Just give it up already," Starkey called out as he slashed out with his sword once more, the blade digging into the armor briefly before the light tightened around his blade and held it tightly. Before he had a chance to pull it free, the spear in Mistoggen's hand shot straight towards him, forcing him to abandon his sword in favor of avoiding a fatal wound to his side. "What is the point of this all? All we are both going to do is waste time fighting. We could be achieving the same result right now if we just ignored this mess and left it to everyone else to deal with." "And I told you that's not an option for me," Mistoggen replied, lunging at Starkey once again. altering the shape of the light around his spear once more as he saw Stark begin to move to the side, intending to try and avoid the strike and reclaim his sword. He widened the light as far as he could, his lunge with the spear covering the full width his spear was horizontally. Instead of backing away from the widened strike, Stark charged at it without a care, bringing his hand down on the top of the light as it reached him to use it to leap over unopposed, the only damage being done to his hand that was quickly repairing itself. Grabbing his sword as he passed, this time having his strength ready and managing to rip it free from the armor, even if it tore out a chunk of the hard light with the blade itself, he spun in the air so that he was facing Mistoggen once again. Unlike before, however, this time he didn't try to make a move, instead scratching his chin in thought. "Guess I have no choice here," he spoke quietly, waiting for Mistoggen to turn around. "Sure you want to keep going?" Mistoggen's charge at him was all the answer he needed to make him sigh. "So be it." Zero. Mistoggen heard the word and knew what to expect. A zero could be any color and would draw energy in and compress it into a sphere before unleashing all its destructive power forward. It was a technique all Minos-level hollows knew and one of their most deadly techniques. This was all common knowledge to him and many others, as was the fact that charge times could vary from hollow to hollow. Charging up longer could add in more power, so firing prematurely normally resulted in a much weaker zero than it could be. So knowing all that, he was shocked speechless when a fully formed zero appeared right before him, hovering just a bit in front of Stark, and fired immediately. There was no time to dodge at this range nor time to try and retreat back. All Mistoggen could do was brace against the attack in front of him, thrusting forward with his spear in an attempt to part the zero around his body, the light around the spear shaping into a wide shield to cover his body. It was partially successful. Energy did part around him at the spear's point, but the power he had hurried pushed into the weapon to do such a thing wasn't enough. Pieces of hard light broke apart as bits and pieces of the zero's energy tore through the hastily constructed defense, slamming against Mistoggen himself and into his light armor. And each hole that was made in the shield only weakened the construct more, additional streams of energy from the zero leaking through and slamming into Mistoggen himself. It was relentless, it seemed to Mistoggen, but eventually the zero died down, as all zeros did. Taking deep breaths as his armor rapidly began to repair itself, Mistoggen eyed his enemy warily, the hollow making no aggressive moves and instead simply observing him. One hit. That had all it had taken to reduce him to this. He could not take on a zero like this in a battle of power with only this level of magical power. He would lose, he was certain of it. The only chance he might have of overcoming it was his spear's shooting star technique, and that would mean losing his spear for a few moments until it could return to his hands. And even then there was no way to know if it would manage to hit Stark in the process. He could miss entirely if he got his aim off or if Stark moved a bit after firing the zero. It would have to be a last resort move. Instead he would focus on dodging for now and switch to fighting at range with his heavenly body magic. It would give him some more time to avoid the zeros, since if they could all be fired that quickly there was no way he would be able to dodge at such close range. His armor may have been far better at taking on magical attacks than physical attacks, but even it had its limit against such destructive force. Speeding back through the air, he tried to immediately make distance between himself and Stark while the hollow was still being lax. His left hand stretched out before himself, a golden circle of magic forming before his palm and expanding out. 16 heavenly stars. He shouted as the magic activated, 16 beams of light flying out of the magic circle and rushing straight towards Stark. The hollow made no moves to move nor to try and block the beams with his sword. He just stood there, lazily, until zero. Another bright blue beam of light tore through the sky, the zero having been charged and fired in barely any time at all. Seeing it at a distance was an entirely different experience to seeing it close up though, and Mistoggen had more than enough time to react as he darted up out of the beam's radius. As he flew he left trails of magic in his wake, drawing out magic circles in the sky ready for launch. Solar dance. From the 5 completed circles fired massive concentrations of light, bombarding Stark's position from above. The attacks would have crushed groups of hollows underneath its blasts normally and could definitely cause some damage to be done to a hollow like Stark while still in his unreleased state. And it was going to until zero. Not one to give up, Mistoggen continued to draw magic circles in the sky, his constant movement already having him far away from the current Zero's range. With a snap of his fingers, the 5 magic circles he had drawn lined up in layers, each glowing brightly as magic passed from one to the other. Nova Beam. From the furthest magic circle tore forward a beam of light, the beam widening with each magic circle that it passed through and growing dramatically in strength. An attack like this was sure to tear into Stark with the power it held and at least cause him some significant harm. And it would have done normally except Zero. It was ridiculous to Mistogen how one word could change and undo so much work and magic. Every time Stark uttered that single 4-letter word, it released a beam so powerful nothing he threw at it could overcome its power completely. His latest spell came close and managed to tear through, but by the time it did so it had been weakened so much that Stark was able to deflect it with the back of his palm, the energy slamming into the ground below and against the hollows that surged beneath them. He knew he was a fairly strong individual. He prided himself on the skills he had built up over 7 years, and he knew he wasn't overpowered like this very often. Generally, if their power was close to his own, he could at least match them for the most part, unless of course they were like Bambietta, who just tore apart every attempt he made to stop her. But he knew there still was a gap between him and those at the top. And it was that which was making him worry right now, knowing that Stark hadn't even used his resurrection yet. "You mind answering a question?" he called out to Stark, the hollow looking up in surprise for a moment before giving a nod. "What rank are you?" "What rank?" Stark frowned before looking at the back of his left hand, hidden beneath a glove. Then, ever so slowly, he removed the article of clothing and chucked it down to the ground below, holding up the back of his hand towards Mistogen. It was hard to make out at this distance, but the shape was distinct enough to give an indication of what number it represented, and Stark's words right after only confirmed what he could see. "I'm the second Espada, Coyote Stark. In other words, I'm the 3rd strongest Arrancar and Hollow out of the entire army, including Lord Barragan." Mistogen didn't say anything, but instead he was swearing. 3rd strongest. There was no way as well that this Hollow wasn't a Vastolord with that kind of power and rank. He had hoped he wasn't, but the facts were staring him right in the face. Out of all the enemies here, why was it him he had to be in this situation again too? Last time it was Blue Note, this time it was Stark. Could he not even catch a break? Still, something bothered him. They all knew this was likely a trap. It was bait meant to draw out Ichigo, which was why he had to do his best to keep most of his magic under wraps. But if this was a trap, why was the 3rd strongest Arrancar facing him, not Ichigo? Why was he wasting time here when he could be elsewhere? There was something he wasn't seeing. Something that didn't add up. He shook his head. No matter how much he tried to think on it, he couldn't see the reason for it. And apparently neither could Jelal, else the man would have been rubbing it in his face. If anything, the man had started quieting down, watching the fight in what he supposed was curiosity to him. That was a small blessing, he supposed, but for now all he could do was focus on the fight. Strictly speaking, it wasn't impossible for him to win. Very difficult, yes, but not impossible. Right now Stark was merely throwing raw power at him. He had and still was enduring against the man, and without his legendary spell too. Blue Note had been so difficult to face because his gravity magic had made him almost untouchable at times, but Stark was reachable. He just had to get a clean hit on the hollow at a prime opportunity. Speeding back across the sky, he rapidly traced out magic circles, not caring about the size and power this time and instead focusing on mass quantity. They all fired the second they were completed, dozens of beams firing at Stark from all directions in front of himself. Zero. The beam this time was far wider than before, but Mistogen knew it was weaker. Just like when he widened his weapon's reach, it meant you had to distribute more power across a wider area. The Zero was no difficult. It may still have been a mass amount of destructive energy, but now that destructive energy was spread out thinner in each area. Even if Stark tried to compensate by adding more energy, Mistogen was confident in the fact that he would not be able to do that without a longer charge time. So rather than dodge like before, Mistogen dove right into that very storm, praying he was right. His armor took a massive beating as he tore through, but it still withstood the blast, though most of it was hanging on by threads. Flying through the epic entree of the Zero, appearing right before Stark to the hollow's surprise, he stabbed forward with his spear as fast as he could. Stark was just that little bit faster, his sword slicing up through the air and deflecting the spear just past his side. The tip still drew blood, scraping across skin as it passed and leaving a long thin cut across Stark's side, but it was not the place Mistoggen had been aiming for to end the fight. The wound itself was barely an inconvenience to Stark as his instant regeneration kicked in, Mistoggen rapidly trying to speed away from Stark now that he was this close. Zero. Stark never turned. He continued to face the way he had been facing all this time before now, and yet a zero still formed, this time at the back of his neck. Mistoggen didn't even have a second's warning before it fired, tearing through the sky towards him with the full strength of its destructive force. There was no choice, Mistoggen thought as he spun round to face the beam of destruction. He wouldn't be able to dodge in time. If there was ever a time to use a last resort move, it was now. As fast as he could he threw his spear forward, light exploding off the end as it tore through the sky like a missile. The zero parted where it flew, unable to even halt the deadly projectile as it rocketed towards Stark's exposed and unguarded back. At the last moment he clearly saw why Stark was the third strongest. Faster than ever before, the hollow spun round, slicing out with his sword at the last possible moment and deflecting the spear completely. Instead of slamming into him, it slammed into the ground behind him, leaving a crater in its wake as the energy contained within exploded outwards. Though it all, Stark weathered through it, far enough away to avoid the brunt of the blast and with magical power high enough to deal with what was left. Gesturing with one hand, Mistoggen willed the spear to return to him. The weapon tore itself out from the ground and shot through the air towards him, almost reaching his outstretched palm when Stark appeared, the two of them. With one hand he grabbed the spear, halting its movements completely, while with the other he swung down, his sword cutting across Mistoggen from his shoulder to his hip. The strike broke through his weakened armor like it wasn't even there. The blow, when combined with the damage already done by the zero, enough to disrupt Mistoggen's meteor spell and send him plummeting towards the ground. His magic burst back to life as his focus returned through the pain just in time to slow his fall, but he still hit the ground hard, his armor shattering in areas and struggling to repair itself. His spear landed next as Stark released it, falling just a few feet ahead of Mistoggen himself before Stark landed beside it. "Ah, this is such a pain," Stark muttered, one hand scratching the back of his head while the other held his sword lazily by his side. "You're strong," he added as he continued to speak, looking down at Mistoggen as the man struggled to try and move, his spear just out of his reach. "That's why I hate guys like you. I need to actually put effort into my work rather than just take it easy like I normally do." Mistoggen could only groan as he continued to stretch out his arm towards his spear. His whole body hurt, his arms the worst. Each was covered in a collection of dark burns from the exposure to the zeros fired at him one after the other. His armor of light had done a good job at taking most of the damage for him, but he simply hadn't been able to regenerate the armor fast enough when compared to how fast the zeros had been fired at him. With his concentration flickering, he felt what remained of his armor begin to unravel around him, breaking off constantly into what light that glittered in the sky like dust as it scattered. Seeing what Mistoggen was reaching for, Stark sighed before placing his foot down on the spear. "Just stay down. If you promise to stop fighting, I won't harm you any further. I'll even protect you from the hollows if you will just stay put for a bit." "Like the hell I'll do that," Mistoggen snarled before his hand finally made contact with the spear, his fingers wrapping around the familiar light metal it was made out of. Tightening his grip, he did his best to pull himself forward, his grip correcting itself as he got close enough to properly take hold of the weapon. All the while Stark continued to watch, his foot unmoving. "This is pointless. You can't win. I haven't even used my full strength yet." "Funny," Mistoggen replied, trying and failing to pull the spear up and dislodge Stark's foot from it. "I'll say the same thing myself." Golden light burst back to life around Mistoggen, lighting up his weapon in the same instant. Stark tried to keep his foot down on the weapon for a few seconds longer, pushing down with all his strength, but the magic building beneath it would not be stopped, forcefully pushing him back as it began to take shape. It didn't stop small like it had with the light armor. It continued to grow, its size increasing with every moment that passed and taking Mistoggen with it in the center of it. Despite knowing he should interfere now, Stark could only watch as the light continued to mold itself into the correct shapes, solidifying into arms and legs only for additional layers to build more texture to the body. It was almost like he was watching a sculpture being built before his very eyes, his gaze unable to be torn away. Legendary spell, Mist Ogden called out as the spell finished forming, the giant's head reaching the clouds. Danga Jiao. Well, you weren't kidding about not being at full power now, were you? Muttered Starkey as he stared up at Mist Ogden in the center of the massive construct. I hate stuff like this. I just want to go home and rest. Sighing, he reluctantly brought his blade back to the ready. Unfortunately, I doubt I have a choice here. Raising his left fist up, Mist Ogden slammed it down on the ground, the hard light crashing down on top of Starkey. The Arrancar waited until the last moment before he acted, a blue zero forming in front of his eyes and firing directly up. The massive beam collided with the light and held it in place. For a moment. And then the fist began to push back, slowly making headway through the beam. For Starkey there weren't many choices available. Despite how fast he could fire zeros, his options were limited in a situation like this. He could increase the power of his zero further, but he had already tried doing that slightly, and all it did was halt the fist for a fraction of a second before it began moving again. Perhaps if he put enough power into it he could blast the fist back, but there was also the possibility of Mist Ogden amplifying the strength of the fist further with magical power because, as far as he could tell right now, this feat before him was done through the sheer raw physical power of the hard light pressing down on him. He couldn't just move while the zero was firing without consequence either. The second he moved, the zero would be disrupted by his lack of proximity, and the force opposing the fist would vanish all at once. He would have a tiny window to get out of the way if he didn't want to be crushed beneath the fist. It wouldn't kill him, at least one hit wouldn't be able to do that, but he had a feeling that if he got pinned for a few seconds that he wouldn't be allowed to get back up again. Making his move, he took his chances with dodging. The second he moved slightly out from under his zero, the force began to vanish. Pushing his speed to the limit, he used all the skill he had with Sonido and shot out from underneath the fist, just in time to feel the wind from the shockwave hit him from behind. He had been mere millimeters away. That's some crazy brute force, he muttered as he turned up to the sky again, watching as Mist Ogden withdrew his fist from the ground. You really sure you want to do this? Mist Ogden nodded, even though in his head he was having his doubts. That attack just then had confirmed his feelings on the matter. Like this, he could win. His power was greater than Starkey's, providing he could make contact and could weather through the storm of zeros that would inevitably be fired his way. However, there was a reason he hadn't wanted to use this. Because if he pushed Starkey too far, he might come face to face with the man's resurrection. He needed to stay in that middle ground. Make Starkey believe he could win as he was and then crush him the second an opening appears. If Starkey used his resurrection, he doubted he could push his legendary spell any further to deal with that influx of power. Only Jelal would be able to stop him then, and he did not want to use that option. Starkey was the one to finally make the next move. A zero briefly began to appear before him, completing its charge-up time in an instant, but before it could fire, a piercing screech filled the air. Mist Ogden tried to protect his ears from the sound, the construct he was in copying his actions, and his eyes could only widen in shock as his construct flickered for a moment, as if about to fade away. It took a few seconds for the scream to die down and for his construct to stabilize, but it left him wondering where on earth the sound had come from. Had it been another hollow? The mere thought of hollows snapped his focus back to reality, his gaze shooting down towards the hollow below who had been just about to fire a zero. However, instead of seeing a giant beam of destruction, all he saw was the dispersion of energy as the zero broke apart where it stood in the air. Oh, Starkey muttered, his head slowly turning to look towards the distance where the scream had come from. That's not good. Not good at all. Protector of the Fairies. A hollow designed to kill one. Unwilling to wait for the smoke to clear, Ichigo acted first, pulling back the larger of the two blades as he funneled energy directly into the blade. Waiting just long enough for the energy to begin to overflow out around the blade itself, he swung it wonder-wise, releasing the Getsuga Tenshou from the blade and letting it soar through the air. His aim was perfect and he had fired it off before Neutra could even get a chance to stop him. And yet, rather than tear into the hollow hidden in the smoke, he instead could only watch as a long thin arm stretched out from within and touched the energy. The arm should have been torn apart. The palm of the hand that touched it should have been burnt away by the raw magic it was touching, That was how much power he had packed into that one strike. And yet the second the hand touched it, all the energy rushing towards Wonder Weiss vanished, as if it had never been there to begin with. What the hell? Ichigo muttered. He could understand if his attack had been blocked. He could understand if it had been destroyed. He could even understand if it had been absorbed. But for it to vanish so suddenly like that? Zanjitsu. No idea, stated the hollow side of Zanjitsu. Pisses me off though. That's my power, he's doing that too. Why the hell is he ruining my fun? Be careful Ichigo, the Quincy side of Zanjitsu added in, his voice uncertain. Something about this hollow seems off. No kidding, Ichigo muttered. It's bad enough he's disrupting my power, but stopping an attack like that too? One is a coincidence, two is intentional. Better be on your guard, he heard his brother say, his Aetherless self speaking up warily as he continued his observations through the magic around them. His magical power rose a bit, that's nothing new, but what is odd is that I'm sensing drops in almost every single entity with hollow power in the nearby area. Maybe even all of them. Ichigo froze for a moment. All of them? Yes. All of them. Including, from the look of it, you. How clever of them, Mavis spoke up, hanging from Ichigo's shoulder as her gaze shifted between Neutra, who was clutching at the hole in his chest, and the smoke that hid Wonder Weiss. It's even affecting their own allies. Rather than try and target you directly, with something that may or may not work, they instead are utilizing a solution that will have to work for certain. If everything with hollow power weakens, it's obvious that even you will be caught in it despite your Quincy and Shinigami powers. They knew I'd come here, Ichigo replied back to her. This is the trap we were waiting on. Thousands and thousands of hollows are here for one purpose. To split us up, keep me alone, and then to be sacrificed to hold the others at bay while these two, or rather one, try to deal with me permanently. I'd offer to help out, he heard his Aetherless self say, but if I step out people will take note. I'll do my best to keep a higher influx of magic coming to you though, so feel free to fight all out. Thanks. Realizing he had a few more seconds before the smoke cleared completely, he took the chance to rush at Neutra nearby, slashing up with the larger of his two blades. Before it could make contact, however, Ichigo felt a chill go down his spine, just before a hand shot out from behind him and touched the blade. At the same moment that the blade shattered, the magical power of Wonder Weiss reappeared in full force, the effects of Sonido fading as the hollow let out a small screech behind him. Seeing that Neutra was looking shocked too, he used the chance to slash out with his second blade as he spun, the impact against the scythes shattering some of them and forcing Neutra back a few steps from the impact. At the same time, his now empty hand clenched into a fist and shot forward, his strength being enhanced by his blood as it slammed into Wonder Weiss's chest. The blow should have sent Wonder Weiss flying. Instead it didn't even move an inch. The fist slammed into its chest before the odd composition of armor and flesh he could see making up the hollow's new body rippled like waves, the whole force of his blow being dispersed across the hollow's entire body. Letting out a small screech, the look in Wonder Weiss's eyes far more cruel looking than before, Wonder Weiss returned the blow with one of his own, swiping out with its free hand and slamming it against Ichigo. Ichigo barely had enough time to bring up the blade he had left when the hand hit the blade. It didn't shatter like his other blade had, but the force was still enough to send him flying through the air before coming to a stop as he slammed into the ground. Some type of shock absorption, Mavis spoke up, her eyes locked on Wonder Weiss's new form. Got to be. I mean, just look at him. Ichigo nodded as he got to his feet, getting his first clear look at Wonder Weiss's resurrection. The hollow was now twice its original size and yet seemed much thinner than before, at least it did with its top half. Its arms had shrunk to half their previous width in exchange for the increased length, almost like someone had shoved them through a stretcher. Its legs meanwhile had widened drastically, almost making it seem like they would be too cumbersome to move with. Considering how fast the hollow had moved to sneak up on him again, however, it was clear that was not actually the case. There's a lot of strength there, he heard his hollow muttering. He could get a lot of speed just from pushing off the ground if he puts his full strength into it. The Quincy side of his powers made a small sound of agreement before adding his own advice. Wonder Weiss probably isn't fast at turns, those legs will make its movements difficult to adjust, but beware of his initial acceleration. In a direct line this hollow will be fast. Ichigo nodded, taking in the rest of the hollow's features. The main body of the hollow looked like flesh at first and then armor at a second glance. The way it seemed to ripple as the hollow breathed confirmed however that it was both. Armor that moved as flesh? Something like could not be made by normal means, but hollows were difficult creatures. Such evolutionary forms were not unheard of for them. Connecting the arms to the body however was the oddest part. The shoulders were massive, stretching up to the height of the hollow's head, which had now been covered in a weak form of the flesh-type armor, and seemed to bulge in areas every so often, as if something from within was just waiting to burst out. "Any ideas on what we're expecting here, Mavis?" Ichigo asked, not taking his eyes off the hollow before him. Mavis could only let out a sigh as she shook her head, disappointment in her voice as she spoke. "No, unfortunately. I'm pretty sure we can assume that flesh armor of his is what let him negate your blow, probably funneling it down to its legs and releasing the impact into the ground. I mean, just look where he's standing." Following where Mavis was pointing it with one finger, Ichigo noticed the small cracks stretching out from the ground where Wonder Weiss was standing. It could just be the impact it made when coming to a stop however, so I don't know just yet. As for whatever other techniques it might know, your guess is as good as mine. Figured it would be, Ichigo muttered, sparing a quick glance at Neutra who was replacing his destroyed scythes currently. "We need him gone. I can't face Wonder Weiss easily if I need to keep one eye watching my back. If I used my Bankai there would be no problem, but everyone will know if you use it," Mavis finished for him. "You focus on the situation for now. I'll contact Hibiki and let him know to send someone to relieve you of Neutra. Preferably someone close by. Be quick about it if you would," Ichigo stated, focusing on the two enemies before him as Mavis began the process of contacting Hibiki for them, her mouth making the motions for words that created no sound. Gripping his sword tightly, he noticed how the small action caused Wonder Weiss to tense, the ground cracking more as its legs began to dig in. It was about to make a move and would unleash it the second he tried anything. Light flickered to life in his right hand, the larger form of Zanjutsu beginning to reform. It would only take a second, but a second wasn't fast enough, Wonder Weiss closing the gap between them with one large leap as it shot forward from its starting position. Caught slightly off guard, Ichigo immediately brought the smaller blade forward, slashing up as a fist rocketed towards him. While the flesh armor may have been tough against brute force, slashes from swords were another matter entirely. The arm was split down the middle as the sword tore through it, the flesh armor barely providing any resistance on its arm to stop the blow. Wonder Weiss let out a screech of pain for a moment, not nearly as deafening as before but still a painful noise to hear, before the two split pieces of the arm began to regenerate. They didn't regenerate naturally however. For Ichigo, whenever his instant restoration happened in cases like this, it would either discard half of the damaged area and regenerate entirely new tissue and bone, or it would pull the two pieces back in place and repair the damage caused. The former used up a lot of magical power when compared to the latter, but in times like this, where the object causing the wound was still in play, it was far more efficient as it would free the trapped area from healing around the weapon and trapping it in their body. Neither of these two methods happened with Wonder Weiss however. Instead, both halves of the arm began to regenerate, new tissue and bone growing from each half. Rather than joining back into one limb, Ichigo now found himself face to face with two arms on Wonder Weiss's right side, both of which were now past the guard he had put up. Immediately trying to pull back as Wonder Weiss's two new fists prepared to try and grab him, Ichigo heard the war cry from behind, one eye flickering up as his head turned slightly. Neutra was bearing down on him right from the path he had intended to retreat back, though in any other direction would be blocked by Wonder Weiss at this range. The only choice was backwards, but that would put him right into the waking arms of an attack he might not be able to afford to turn to face if it meant putting his back towards Wonder Weiss. With little choice of what to do, he continued to leap back, heading right towards Neutra even as he continued to face Wonder Weiss. Bony thin hands met thin air as Wonder Weiss's new limbs hit the area he had been in, gripping nothing for a second before Wonder Weiss's eyes locked with his own once more. Of course now he was flying on a collision course for Neutra, moving at a speed he wouldn't be able to stop it. It would only take a second for Wonder Weiss to close the gap, but forcing it to do so would be the tricky part. So instead he hit down on the air, forcing himself into a flip. It was dangerous doing this since it put him in a position where he wouldn't be able to counter from, but he reached the halfway point of the flip just in time, Wonder Wace's instincts not allowing it to ignore his opening. And the hollow was just in time too, as his hand shot down onto the fist flying towards his face, just enough force being pressed down on the limb to use it as a springboard. Finishing his flip right over Wonder Wace, he turned back round just in time to see Neutra's 6 scythes cut down directly into Wonder Wace's chest, leaving 6 large cuts across its body. Regeneration immediately began to kick in, but Ichigo didn't dare let the two of them rest. His Quincy blade sliced across the air in front of him, leaving a small trail of energy behind. Then, like always, he swung down with the larger blade of Zanjutsu. Only no energy was released from that strike, to Ichigo's shock. Not a single drop left his Zanpakuto, despite him knowing very well that he had funneled his power into the blade. Zanjutsu? He asked as he quickly demanded an answer, backing away from the two hollows. What's going on? No idea, the hollow side muttered angrily. The energy should have been released. I felt it happen, in fact. Whatever is happening is on your end, not mine. It's got to be the hollow, Mavis stated to Ichigo, having finished her conversation with Hibiki. It must be blocking your power. But how? Ichigo asked, glancing briefly at the larger blade of Zanjutsu. It couldn't do that before. It could only destroy the blade's physical form. But it did touch the blade once since it took this form, Mavis pointed out. It might have touched more than the physical aspects, considering the blade you hold right now is a newly made version. It's still only limited to your hollow side, but... I get it, Ichigo muttered. He's shutting down what I can do with these powers one by one. Are my hollow powers still dropping? Mavis nodded. Afraid so. It's the same with every other hollow nearby, including Neutra over there, but they are decreasing bit by bit. And if this keeps up, what will happen? Self-destruction, the Quincy side of Zanjutsu whispered to him softly, his voice full of regret. What almost happened to you as a baby before Kisuke introduced your hollow powers to balance out your system. If your hollow powers turn off completely, your own magic will fall out of sync and start to fight amongst itself, destroying you in the process. Baragan thought this trap out very carefully. And considering how well this hollow is suited to fight you, it's probably been years in the making. How long do I have? Ichigo asked, watching Wonder Wace warily. I'm not sure how long it will take to kill this hollow as I am right now, let alone if I start getting weaker. 10 minutes at most, came the response. I can buy you some more time, but it will mean suppressing your Quincy side. You will be left with only your Shinigami techniques and won't be able to use your Zanpakuto if it breaks. Ichigo let out a sigh, resolving himself for the fight ahead. Do it. Give me as much time as you can. And Mavis, tell whoever is coming to hurry the hell up. The moment they get Neutra off my back, I'll throw everything I can at Wonder Wace and crush him before his presence kills me. Protector of the Fairies. Is it happening everywhere? Kisuke asked, Hibiki giving a small sound of confirmation as he scanned the screens in front of him. Pretty much. Scanning each and every hollow out here would take far too long, so I'm running a scan on the overall magical power in the area. Compared to when we started fighting, it's dropped to around a quarter of what it was. Some of that may be from enemy casualties, but a lot of it is coming from the fact that the hollows seem to be weakening. I thought something was up. Their physical power hasn't changed much, but their magical power is barely coming in as a threat right now. Any leads on a source? One in particular, Hibiki replied, waving a hand in front of himself as he brought up a new screen. Come on, he muttered as the image started loading, finally revealing the hollow he could see Ichigo fighting. Got it. Appears to be some kind of Aaron car from what I've been told. Modified at that. Do the hollows even have the intelligence to do this sort of thing? They might, Kisuke stated quietly, remembering the claims of the hollow he had quickly dispatched before. I met an Aaron car here that seemed quite knowledgeable. He might have been involved somehow. Hard to say. Well, whatever powers it gained as a result of this, they are effective. There isn't a single entity with Hollow's power here that isn't being affected. You said entity. How bad is it for Ichigo? Hibiki paused for a second, remembering what Mavis had told him when she contacted him. According to Mavis, he's fine at the moment, but it's 2 against 1. He needs someone to take the second opponent away so he can completely focus on this main hollow. Want me to head over? Kisuk asked as he glanced into the distance where he could sense Ichigo's magical power coming from. I could probably get there in a few minutes if I hurry. I'm not too far. No need. Shinji is already on the way. He'll be able to manage. Kisuk shrugged, accepting the answer for the time being. Keep me informed of any chances. At least we know this is the trap and don't have to be keeping one eye open for another. You say that, but I doubt you can stop yourself from looking. Oh? Have I been figured out by everyone already? Kisuk asked as he smiled to himself. I'm losing my mysteriousness. I doubt you need it, Hibiki replied back with. Glancing at another screen, he added, I'm worried about the barrier though. It's pretty close to breaking. The fact the hollows have all been weakened right now is a godsend for us, but the fact of the matter is that they are too numerous still. If the barrier breaks they will swarm the city, and after that screech earlier, the one that the hollow that Ichigo is fighting made, the barrier is about 1-0 away from breaking. The hollows may not have realized that yet, but that is only because we are making enough noise that they are focusing on us instead of anything else. But it won't last, finished Kisuk for Hibiki. I'm aware. Eventually one hollow might decide to return its attention back to the barrier and realize it's weak enough to break. Taoshiro can't protect the civilians, and neither can us if that happens. At least not while the odds are still stacked against us. Any suggestions? You have to have some kind of plan. Well, you have one. I always have one. I always have many. It's just not all of them will work, and the idea I have in mind. No, it needs more time to be perfected. I'm close, but I'm not there yet. Plus it requires some more ideal circumstances to utilize. So for now it's useless. Yes. Sorry, but the situation is very much out of our hands. We can only count on hope here that we can keep the hollow's attentions long enough to save the city. Suppose so. Best of. Hibiki trailed off, distracted by one of the many screens surrounding him. Luck to. Hibiki. Someone's watching us, Hibiki muttered. At the very edge of my current scan. I'll widen it a bit dash. Don't. Hibiki frowned. What? Kisuk, if someone is watching us dash. We don't want them to know we know that though, do we? Keep your settings as they are. Make sure whoever this person is doesn't know you noticed them, just in case. If they try anything, it's much more effective to deal with them when they assume you aren't aware of them. All right, Hibiki replied hesitantly. I trust you on this. Best of luck to you. Oh, and how have you been so calm this whole time? I thought fighting this many hollows would have your focus too split up to chat. Oh, the hollows. Kisuk smirked as he glanced around him, all the hollows nearby watching him warily from a distance. None made a move as he spoke, and the reason for that was the mountain of corpses littering the ground around him, blood still falling from his soaked sword. Benihime is having her fun with them, so they are starting to keep their distance. She gets very scary after a while, and I think the hollows here finally realized that. It's so easy to talk when they are too scared to even approach. Protector of the fairies. Sentry duty, Wall decided, was one of the most boring jobs out there. Hours and hours would pass, sometimes days even, where was doing nothing but this, controlling his many remote copies from a distance and fighting off the odd group of enemies that dared to try and get a bit closer to their army's growing borders. Many a time he had questioned Emperor Spriggan about why he had to do such a menial task, and every time he forgot the reason given for why. He supposed the doubts and complaints he had were simply deleted from his memory, leaving him to go back to his job until he finally had enough and asked again. He had no doubts that despite knowing that he would ask again, and as a result likely lose some of those memories, but he couldn't understand why he had to be here. Why not have a large group of troops ready to repel any would-be attackers? He knew the answer with the highest probability of being correct, however. Power. It all came down to power in the end. Power to stand against any foe approaching, power to adapt to any foe approaching and to find their weaknesses, and the power to coordinate every single one of his clones scattered at the two major borders to the north and south at once. There was no one more suitable for a task like this than him, and so, even though he was one of the Spriggan 12, He had no choice in the matter. He had to do it, whether he liked it or not. Running another brief scan from his clone's internal systems, he was about to skim over the results lazily when a slight trace of magical power hit the edge of his senses. It was tiny enough to miss to normal humans, but as a machine his senses were far more attuned. To him, the minuscule difference between the levels of magical power might have well been as wide as a river. Visual senses burst to life as Wall redirected his full focus onto this clone, leaving the others on standby to alert him if they discovered anything troublesome approaching. He could see nothing, even when his eyesight enhanced itself and zoomed in. The spike had been at the very edge of his senses, so it would take a while before he would actually see anything, but it might be worth taking a look. Emperor Spriggan did give him leeway in matters like this, and he wasn't sure his curiosity would be able to be contained if he didn't go and see what the fuss is. Checking his senses one last time in case the signal was a trap to draw him away, he began to move, and once he confirmed it was truly safe. Clearing large distances with jumps would be too conspicuous, and flying would give him no cover. So instead he modified this legs for speed and began to run, traveling across the ground at a leisurely pace. Each second brought him a bit closer to the small spike of power, and each second also revealed the scope of the spike too as it began to spread out across the area. A fight was definitely going on, and a large one at that. Finally coming a point suitable far enough but close enough for his enhanced vision to see into the distance, he felt his face scrunch up into a frown as he saw the sight before him. Hollows. Normally this wouldn't shock him very much, but this was the south battlefield border, not the north battlefield border. Hollows shouldn't even be down at these parts. And where was the Quincy King to keep this lot out? His army must have left this area alone and was focusing more heavily on other areas for a force of this mass to appear. Thousands and thousands and thousands of hollows, all hungry for their next meal. This wasn't some normal infiltrator. This was a vanguard force. But it still didn't explain how they got there of all places. Unless a rogue Quincy, maybe, drawing soldiers away from the area to ensure that the Quincy couldn't assume full control over the nearby area? Ever since the reports came in of something happening to Ziref's forces in the west, Wywak had been making his play on the area. More and more Quincy were being diverted to combat the demon forces, and, for some reason, the demons were not being replenished like they had originally been. It was an odd situation all around, but the result was Wywak trying to break the power balance by taking full control of Ziref's territories. Was this the result of that? Had Baragan decided to put a halt to the Quincy King's ambitions, desiring some of the territory himself, and was now launching large strikes on the Quincy they hadn't been able to reach before? Considering how passive the leader of the Hollows had been so far, it seemed unlikely, but perhaps this was his first major play of the war, having bided his time for this moment. Whatever the case, it was worth reporting back to Emperor Spriggan. It even appeared that the Hollows were engaged with something too, so that would be helpful information to know. Getting a bit closer, he managed to spot the village in the far distance, surrounded by the cube barrier. That didn't hold his eyes for long, however. They were instead drawn to the massive ship in the sky, the one known as the Genesis. Suddenly the news was far more pressing than before. If the Genesis was here, there was a good chance Ichigo Kurosaka was too. Emperor Spriggan would want to know this. He would want to know this indeed. Protector of the Fairies. Darting between blows as fast as he could, Ichigo kept up his retreat, the larger of his two blades long since destroyed. Repairing it would have been a simple task if he could access his Quincy powers, but, true to Zanjitsu's words, they were completely shut off for now in the hopes of stemming off the inevitable self-destruction awaiting him. His smaller blade, while still dangerous if it hit, could no longer absorb enemy attacks like Zero's, and Neutra had been making the most of that to fire one every few seconds. He could still utilize the Getchuga Tenshou luckily, but it was weaker than it normally was, missing the elements added in by his Quincy side to enhance the blast launched from the smaller blade. Hada number 32. He muttered quietly as he held his blade out horizontally towards the enemy. Ukasen. As a result, he was being forced to rely on a lot of Kidu. Physical blows could work on Neutra, but Wonder Weiss had a habit of jumping in at the worst moments every time he tried and would take the blow for Neutra. Each time he could tell it infuriated the Hollow, but not enough for it to tell Wonder Weiss to stop, valuing its life more than its pride right now. Waiting briefly for the Kidu to connect, he let a small smile appear on his face as Neutra sliced through the Kidu with his scythes. At least the old tactics worked, he thought as he swiped out with his free hand. Bakuda number 63, Sajasabaku. The dispersing light snapped back towards Neutra, wrapping around him as chains and pinning his arms to his sides. That wouldn't hold for long, so he had to be quick. Kicking back off the air behind him, he shot forward, an orb of lightning appearing in his right hand as he skipped the incantation entirely. Hada number 63, Reikau Urhau. As he shot his arm forward, only a few meters away from Neutra, the lightning exploded forth from the orb and shot towards the hollow. Wonder Weiss, however, appeared right in between the two of them in that moment, bringing up its many thin arms to block the strike. It singed the skin and even tore off the first two arms as it burst through the flesh, but that was all it managed, the hollow's skin finally managing to stop the strike with its remaining arms. That had been an annoying tactic it had started doing. Its AoE by itself wasn't quite strong enough to stop a Kida spell of that level, but when layered over itself it could endure. Immediately the arms began to regenerate, healing up to their original state. This was another thing he had to be careful of. He was lucky the flesh had been torn off there, because if a single piece had remained, then the result would have been the same thing as before, regenerating multiple arms in place of one. As of this moment, Wonder Weiss had a grand total of 11 arms, 4 on his left and 7 on his right. It made him look much more freakish than before and did make one side stronger than the other. However, the hollow was good with its instincts, keeping him at bay with all those arms and halting his progress. And every time he did get past, Neutra was there waiting for him, realizing there was only one place he was aiming for with the best chance of success currently. Realistically, the best way to end this would be a high-level Kidoo. He had one that could work, but the issue came from whether or not he could get the time to pull it off, and with the two of the hollows around, the answer was no. If backup didn't get here soon, he might really be forced to use his Bankai if he wanted to live past today, and as a result would immediately need to be evacuated back to the barrier to prevent any big assaults happening in his confirmed absence. Any sign of anyone? He asked, a question he had lost track of how many times he had asked it. Mavis could only shake her head, her eyes glancing into the distance as she let out a sigh. Still nothing. Hibiki said someone was on their way, but there's still thousands of hollows out there that could be delaying him. That about right? Mavis nodded in disappointment. Yeah. They may be weaker, but they still pose a threat in such high numbers. Maybe he'll be here in a minute. Maybe 5. Maybe 10. I just don't know currently. I'm sorry. It's not your fault, Ichigo replied, being forced to immediately dodge as Wonder Weiss accelerated right at him, 3 of its 11 hands slicing through the air where his chest had been. He immediately struck out with his smaller blade and dug it into the hollow's side, firing a Getsuga Tenshou straight through the hollow's chest. It did a lot of damage to it, tearing apart the area where the blade had stabbed into, but the hollow's skin acted almost as if it was responding to the attack from within, keeping the damage compressed to one side and stopping it from getting more than halfway through the hollow's body. This was a trap after all. He said louder than he needed to, slamming his foot against one of the arms reached towards him and knocking himself away from the hollow. None of the actual force did anything to the hollow, even its weak thin limbs not being forced around by him kicking back off it. Landing back on the ground, one hand raised up towards Wonder Weiss as it began to regenerate, he started to chant the name of a Kida spell. Hada number dash. Your left. Ichigo muttered a thanks to Mavis as he threw away his efforts at finishing the Kidoo, rolling underneath the scythes that sliced through the air before digging into the ground he had been kneeling at. His smaller blade shot up, but Neutra hadn't used all his blades, the remaining 4 scythes forming a guard in front of him while an additional 2 began to form behind them as he abandoned his stuck scythes. Ichigo's blade dug in, but Neutra's combined guard held strong, holding back the smaller blade even as it slowly began to dig into the metal. You know, there's one thing I've been wondering, mentioned Ichigo as he stared at Neutra. Why are you so desperate for me to die? Neutra laughed before snarling, you really want to know? I would have thought it was obvious. You're an enemy. Yes. Yes, I am. But this seems very personal to you, and I only just met you, so I doubt I could have done much to piss you off yet. I haven't even fought that many hollows in this war since Baragan has been so quiet. That made a response. There was anger in the hollow's eyes, but not until Baragan's voice was mentioned. Oh, that's it, isn't it? You honestly don't care about me personally. But whatever Baragan did to you is making you override all your personal feelings on the matter. The way you look when you are forced to rely on Wonder Weiss, the annoyance you show at using surprise attacks, you're a pretty honest fighter, aren't you? So what if I am? Doesn't change the fact that I'm running out of time. You would have been great to fight. Fighting someone with all my strength and either winning by killing my opponent or dying by their hand, either is a fate I am happy with. But to continue that life I first need you to die no matter what so I can live. If I kill you, Lord Baragan will save me. Ichigo wanted to say something but he found himself cut off as he was suddenly pulled back, his smaller blade being ripped from his hands as he found himself hoisted into the air and pulled a few meters back. Being spun round he found himself face to face with Wonder Weiss, a look of cruel joy on the Hollow's face. "Mavis, any ideas here?" he asked quickly, struggling to break free. That look wasn't good. He had to get out now. But despite his efforts, he couldn't break out. The Hollow's shock absorption was taking in all the force he tried to put into his body to wrestle free of its grip. "Mavis. I'm trying." Mavis replied hurriedly, rapidly trying to think of any solution that could get them out of this. "Do you think you can endure a few hits? It may let its guard down if it thinks it has you." The sound of flesh being broken caught their attention as the top of Wonder Weiss's shoulders broke apart, dozens of arms appearing from within. "How many is a few?" "Not that many," she shouted back in a panicked voice, her eyes widening in fear as the arms prepared to shoot forward. "Hurry! Use my power! Collapse, Sauconade!" Ichigo was stopped from activating the last line of defense he had right now, Fairy Sphere, at those two words. Wonder Weiss paused himself for a second, hearing the voice himself. With no one in sight but Ichigo and Neutra, he returned his attention back to Ichigo, letting out a loud screech before every single one of its fists shot forward to pummel Ichigo into pieces. There must have been 100 of the fists rapidly raining down on Ichigo, one after the other slamming towards him until they all became a blur in the mix. Finally Wonder Weiss brought back all its hands together and slammed them forward for one final strike, the force causing a loud crack to sound through the air. A moment later and the arms holding Ichigo up were severed. Ichigo landed on the ground completely unharmed as he dashed back with Shunpo. As he came to a stop, the air around him bent, a figure appearing from within before the light snapped into place behind the two of them. "You have the best timing, Shinji." "I do my best, though it's difficult to confuse someone's perception so much that they miss all those hits. I was flipping his senses multiple times every second. You owe me later for this." "Fair enough." Tilting his head towards Neutra, he asked Shinji, "Mind dealing with him for me? That'll finally give me the chance to clean up here." "Sure thing. I'm a bit weaker than normal right now, I assume you felt the same thing, but he looks weaker too. Give me 5 minutes at most to finish what you started." "Thanks." Watching for a moment as Shinji darted off and engaged Neutra, Ichigo finally gave his undivided attention towards Wonder Weiss. "Finally it's just you and me, huh?" he sighed, counting all the hands for a moment before giving up. "And I'm unarmed too. Physical attacks won't work, my blades are both gone, my hollow powers are being disrupted and my Quincy powers are being suppressed to give me more time. This is honestly a difficult situation you've put me in. All I have left to rely on is Kidu." A small screech was his response. "Won't say anything even now, huh? Well, it doesn't matter. Even with all these advantages you have, it's not going to be enough, I'm afraid. Now that it's just me and you, I'm going to end this once and for all." Wonder Weiss charged at him, but he was already moving, the words of the Kidu he had chosen escaping his lips. "Yeah, Lord. Mask of blood and flesh, all creation, flutter of wings, yeah, who bears the name of man." 100 arms flew at him, but he didn't let them come close, rushing to one side with Shunpo and forcing Wonder Weiss to fly right past him in its charge. On the wall of blue flame, inscribe a twin lotus. In the abyss of conflagration, wait at the far heavens. Wonder Weiss tried to turn towards him, but it was far too late now for it to stop him, and even it knew that with its limited intelligence, all its arms coming up ready to block the strike about to appear. Blue flame-like energy poured around Ichigo's left hand as he raised it towards Wonder Weiss, uttering the last few words that would seal its fate. "Hada number 73, Sauren Sukatsui." The blast tore forth in a manner similar to its weaker counterpart, Sukatsui. Unlike that spell, however, this appeared in far greater quantities. The whole blast of the spell concentrated and released right at Wonder Weiss. The arms held strong for a few moments before they started to break apart, one by one. Wonder Weiss's physical defenses had been impressive, but its magical ones, they were found lacking. As the smoke began to clear, though, Wonder Weiss shot out of it, all but two of its arms ripped to shreds with a crazy look across its face. Ichigo, however, had already been waiting for him, his other hand outstretched with lightning sparking off his fingers. Hada number 88, Hiryu Agekazoku Shinten Reihao. This time there was nothing left. There was far too much magic behind the attack for Wonder Weiss to stop it in its current condition. The sudden release of the spell had shortened its size massively, but it was still large enough to tear a massive hole through the Hollow's chest, the rest of its body scattering as the part holding him together became reduced to nothing. Watching as the Hollow's head fell to the floor nearby, Ichigo eyed the remains carefully for a moment before letting out a small sigh of relief. Finally, he muttered quietly. That was too much of a pain to deal with it. Seems like you're done over there, Shinji stated as he joined Ichigo, Neutra skidding to the ground beside Wonder Weiss's destroyed body. I tried to keep him away from you, but he managed to guess one of my directions enough to make it over here. That's impressive in itself, considering how long you were gone for. It wasn't long. But it's too late for him now. Yeah, it is, said Shinji as his Zanpakuto returned to normal, the blade still held tightly in one hand. With the other he handed Ichigo the sword he had managed to reclaim from the scythes Neutra had used. This is yours, I assume? He asked with a Cheshire smile, Ichigo taking the blade back with a smile. It is, thanks. Holding out his other hand, he felt the familiar weight of his larger blade form in that hand as his Quincy and Hollow powers returned at full strength. Ah, that's better. Finally that Hollow's ability has died down. Turning to Neutra he gave the Hollow a sad smile. Sorry, but your chance to kill me has passed. You won't be able to do it again now. Neutra snarled at him before staring at the head of Wonder Weiss, all that was left of the Hollow made to fight the man before him. Looking at it for a brief moment, his face contorted into rage before he grabbed the head and threw it with all his strength, the head sailing through the air and flying into the midst of the army of Hollows nearby. Damn it! Should we take him prisoner? Shinji asked. He may know some stuff. Ichigo frowned, considering the idea. He's dying. Baragan did something. Mavis, you said it was time magic, right? Mavis nodded, making herself visible to everyone else. Yep. I would recognize that feel anywhere. After analyzing it, I can determine the spell cast on Neutra here is meant to age him, turning him into nothing more than bones and then to dust. Frowning herself, she turned to Neutra. However, it's odd. When did Baragan cast this spell on you? When did he cast it? Neutra looked at her oddly, and it wasn't because he was facing an invisible girl hanging from the back of a man he had been desperately trying to kill like she had been there the whole time. The question itself made him think back, carefully remembering when exactly the spell had been cast. About a month ago. I have around an hour at most if my time is correct. And this spell has been active for that long? Mavis asked hesitantly. Her words made Neutra pause, but even so he nodded. Yeah? Why? I'm sorry. I truly am. What the fuck? What the hell are you apologizing for, huh? What did you do? Nothing. I'm just truly sorry. But that spell never would have waited a month to consume you. I've analyzed it completely and that time limit simply does not fit with the magic itself. It's likely Baragan himself has been manually holding back this magic to prolong your suffering, letting you live in fear. It should have aged you in seconds. That's because he said he was giving me a trial. Neutra declared as he pushed himself to his feet, supporting himself with his newly made scythes. I can recover. He will reverse it. He won't, Ichigo muttered, realizing what Mavis had already known. It can't be reversed, can it, Mavis? No, she replied. It will devour him whole. I don't believe Baragan would stop it even if he could. This wasn't a trail. That's why I'm so sorry. This was both torture and a way to make use of a failed soldier. Ichigo, Shinji, please back away from him. quickly. What's going to happen to him? Shinji asked. He said it casually, but the red Zero slowly charging in his free fist showed he wasn't taking the situation lightly. When he dies, he'll release the energy, Mavis replied. He's a walking bomb. You said your name was Neutra, right? She asked the hollow, Neutra only able to nod dumbly at her question. I truly am so sorry. Shinji, please end this. Shinji needed no further pressing, firing the Zero straight at Neutra's face. The hollow began to make a move to dodge only to halt, the words from before setting in as he accepted all the doubts he had himself that had agreed with their conclusions. And so instead of trying to escape the blast, he moved back in towards it, letting it take him with the comfort that he had at least fallen by an enemy's hands. The second the life left his body, the time magic in his chest exploded out. His body aged rapidly, everything turning to nothing but dust in the end. But the magic didn't stop there, expanding out, and spreading across the very ground they stood on. Rock and stone broke apart as they became accelerated to a future so distant to them, while the faint bits of grass and plants scattered around withered up and died. Ichigo and Shinji continued to retreat back quickly, escaping the deadly zone of time before it finally came to a stop, leaving nothing alive in the area it had touched. You think that was the last bit of trouble? Shinji asked. Ichigo opened his mouth to respond when an explosion from within the hollow army drowned out his voice. Both heads snapped towards it as a mix of Wonder Wace's remaining magical power and Ichigo's own exploded in the midst of the hollow army, expanding out before finally hitting the barrier itself. It had already been weak, and such an attack was the gust of wind it had been waiting for to blow it over. Like a chain reaction, every bit of the barrier shattered around the village and every single hollow roared as a result, their prize finally in reach. One last trap, Ichigo muttered as he stared into the distance at the village, realizing that explosion had been meant to consume him as a last resort if Wonder Weiss died. All that energy it had released that had shared his magical power was the energy he had tried to release from his Zanpakuto with the larger blade. That was why it had simply vanished. Wonder Weiss had taken it into itself. We just can't get a break today, can we? Protector of the Fairies. An ice dragon's last stand. Not good, Taoshiro muttered, his hands gripping his Zanpakuto tightly as he pulled it from its sheath on his back. Not good at all. I'll gather everyone together, the mayor said, beginning to quickly rush around the nearby area that everyone in the village had been scattered around. Do whatever you feel is best. Taoshiro nodded, letting the others around him form some semblance of order and control. There wasn't really anywhere they could all go. They were already all gathered fairly loosely in the village's center, and pushing in a bit more would only increase the space between them and their enemies by a small amount. Still, perhaps he could work with this. There were currently 5 main entrances to the village center, some wider than others. If he blocked off all but one, he could potentially funnel the hollows down that one line and hold off for a bit longer. However, it still raised the problem of what might happen if the hollows decided to just fly above or break through his ice. Perhaps encasing them all in a dome with that plan would be the best move. He sighed. Despite that being a better plan, he doubted he had the magic left to make that much ice. Blocking off the paths would be his limit, with maybe a few bursts of shunpo on top of that. Enough to close the distance from one side of the villagers to the other side about 3 or 4 times. In other words, he could stop attacks coming from a side other than the opening about once, maybe twice at a push, before he would be running off fumes. He couldn't count on the villagers for much help either. His Zanpakuto made the job look easy when he fought hollows. With a single slash he could kill a hollow depending on where he struck, and their masks easily crumbled under his blade. The weapons used by the villagers, if he could call them weapons, were another story. They must have had around 5 swords between themselves, and the rest was a collection of farming equipment and household tools, fashioned into weapons. Knives had been attached to poles with tape to create spears, and bits of table had been fashioned into shields by a lot of the villagers in the hopes that their makeshift weapons would help them achieve the same feat he was producing. But they wouldn't. The metal was too inferior to what was put into a Zanpakuto. A lot of these weapons would likely never even piece the skin, or if they did, then the wounds they would inflict would be minor at best. Those with swords stood the best chance realistically, the blades at least sharp enough to kill the hollows given the right opportunity, but it would still be a tough battle. It was also why those wielding those 5 swords had been placed at different sides of the group of villagers, their last line of defense if he fell. It wouldn't be enough. He could just tell it now. There were far too many hollows left, their numbers countable with enough time but still appearing endless at a glance, and there were far too few of them. He sighed again. There was little use continuing to struggle with such thoughts. They would only serve to weaken his spirit. He still had a chance. It was admittedly a small one, but any chance was better than none. With the barrier falling, it was likely that the others here would retreat to the city in an attempt to halt the hollows from entering or to at least stem the tide significantly. Nodding at the thought, the possibility giving him hope, he began to approach the first entrance to the center of the village and willed his Dragon Slayer magic to come forth. Freezing the area with his Zanpakuta would have been the easier method, but even releasing his Zanpakuta now was beyond him. If it wasn't for his Dragon Slayer magic, he wouldn't even be able to access his ice right now. Carefully freezing the area in front of him to create a large wall, he eyed his work critically, checking for flaws or cracks in its surface. Only when he was happy with its quality and size did he move to the next of the entrances, repeating the process. Once again his magic took a dive. Having so little left made each bit that he used feel massive in comparison to what it was like normally. Even so, he did his best to ignore the feeling, releasing ice bit by bit as he focused on his task. With 2 done, he moved to the third, and that was when he saw it. The first hollow. Not caring if he lost a bit more magic than he needed, he instantly created the wall, having to hope it was fine as he rushed to the last area he needed to build it. He didn't know if the hollow had seen him before he put the wall up, but he really hoped it hadn't. Now seeing the wall, he simply hoped the hollow would go around rather than climb over. The chance for either was around 50-50, so he hoped the hollow's instincts, while still uncertain of where its prey was, would force it to continue searching. If he drew in other hollows at the right entrance too, it might even forcefully draw the hollows that way too if he was really lucky. Reaching the final entrance, he began to rapidly freeze the entrance shut. His ice continued to spread across until it suddenly stopped, 3/4 of the way from completion. He was at his limit. Rushing that previous wall had drained him of what little he had to spare. Swearing he did his best to mold the ice present while it was still malleable, stretching it just far enough to make it look complete. It would be laughably weak, but an illusion was better than none at all. If the hollows came down 2 entrances anyway, then they were all screwed. Eating what was left over, he felt the tiniest scraps of his magic return. Eating one's only element generally did nothing for the user if it was made by their own magic, but he could force the process to squeeze out a tiny amount, even if it was the tiniest fraction of what had been spent. Reaching the final entrance just in time, he was greeted by the roars of hundreds of hollows. Dozens of them were already charging down the street, their eyes having spotted the villagers and showing their hunger freely. Holding his sword up towards the incoming crowd, he braced himself as best as he could before finally leaping forward. His sword swung through the air in an arc before 2 hollows hit the ground, their bodies already beginning to disintegrate. He couldn't rest though, not when the hollows had yet to fixate on him. He immediately stepped back as fast as he could and spun, slashing through a 3rd hollow at its waist. A 4th hollow finally focused on him, realizing the threat he posed to its easy meal. It lunged at him with its mouth wide open, intended to tear him apart with its teeth alone, before he darted back a step, his sword coming up and slicing through the hollow's mask. The damage had been done though. While this hollow had focused on him, the others rushing towards the villagers had not. If they had noticed him over their hunger, then they were purposefully ignoring him as they charged after their greater prize. Using the last drops of magic he had managed to recover, he rushed forward, speeding past all of them with a burst of shunpo. That was it. That was his last card that he could play, and now it was gone. But it didn't matter, not when now the hollows were noticing him properly. He had gotten their attention by getting in their way again, and he doubted they would ignore him anymore until he was either a bloody mess on the ground or being eaten alive until he bled out. Raising his sword defiantly, he swung at the nearest hollow, splitting it down the middle before it even had a chance to react. 2 hollows swung at him from behind, but he avoided them by pulling the fading body of their dead ally back with him, using its body as a shield before leaping over the remains and slashing down with his Zanpakuto. Another hollow fell, but there were still 10 of them surrounding him. 4 this time rushed him, coming from all sides, so he used their own attacks against one another, ducking right under their wild strikes at the last moment and letting them hit their own allies. His sword swung through the air once more as they began to reel back in pain, taking away another 2 hollows as he followed up with an additional strike. 8 more for now. He could do this. Rushing the nearest hollow, he rolled under its claws as they swiped out at him before slicing through the hollow's legs. The second it began to fall, he struck again, easily hitting the mask as it fell towards him. He was slow to react, however, when another hollow snuck up behind him, costing him dearly as sharp claws sliced across his back. His sword sliced through the air once more as he spun and another hollow fell, but it was still too late. The injury wouldn't be vanishing anytime soon, the back of his clothes beginning to become soaked in his own blood. Each move he made caused his back to explode in pain. He couldn't dull it without magic nor heal it, so all he could do was endure it. So he did, tuning out the pain to the best of his ability as he turned to face the 6 hollows remaining. They were approaching slightly slower than before, finally accepting the fact he was a threat. And nothing was more dangerous than a wounded animal when it knew death was approaching. It would fight far harder than ever before, and that was what made them hesitate in approaching him recklessly. They didn't want to join their brethren too early. It was too bad they didn't have a choice. He rushed them before they could finally decide to make a move, swinging his sword at the furthest left hollow. He missed though, not stepping in far enough, but the hollow still tried to dodge on reflex, knocking into his own allies by accident. That was the chance Toshiro needed, leaping at the group and slashing through 3 hollows in one full-powered swing. The result left him unsteady, the pain his back immediately exploding into the center of his mind again for a moment, before he recovered, just in time to block the fist of one of the 3 remaining hollows. It slammed against his Zanpakuto, the skin splitting against its edge, but he didn't have enough strength left to hold his ground. Instead he was sent flying back from the impact, hitting the ground hard as his Zanpakuto slipped from his hands. His hand shot out to try and reclaim it, but the hollows pushed their assault, as if realizing the sudden weakness he had gained and were trying to capitalize on it. He dodged as best as he could, but it was difficult. The hollows were physically stronger and faster than he was without magic. He had only been able to fight them so well because he could rely on the power his Zanpakuto had in its edge, but now even that minor advantage was gone. Cuts and scrapes started to appear across his body as he continued to dodge blows, unable to successfully avoid the strikes entirely. Each one made him feel a little more of his already drained stamina further diminish, and he knew if he didn't do something soon he would die. He needed to get back to his Zanpakuto. Taking a risk, he rushed forward as another strike came at him. Before, all he had been able to do was retreat in order to dodge these fatal strikes, so moving towards the hollow as it tried to attack was almost certainly fatal. But continuing to retreat would have been fatal anyway. He practically threw himself down to the ground as the claws neared him, the deadly weapons sailing over his head by mere millimeters, before he forced himself into a roll and broke out into a run at the end of it. A few meters. That was all he had to cross to reach his sword. A few meters in which all 3 of the remaining hollows would be right on his tail, ready to devour him. But in the end, what did he have to lose? He was halfway to his sword when the first strike happened, the claws of one hollow swinging at him from above. He managed to barely avoid it by moving to one side, a shallow cut still appearing across his arm in the process. The second hit came without warning, however, pain bursting into existence from his back once more as a fist slammed into him. He had little hope of stopping such a blow with his Zanpakuto, let alone without it, and was powerless to stop his body from sailing across the ground. Hitting the ground hard, he let out a small groan as he tried to push himself up. He felt his hand touch metal as he did so, a smile briefly returning to his face as he recognized what exactly he had landed beside. Pushing himself up onto shaky feet, he held up his reclaimed Zanpakuto, staring down the 3 hollows as they charged him. They all were leaping at him at once, trying to finish off what they had to assume was helpless prey now, when he stepped forward and swung, another hollow joining its dead brethren. Skidding underneath the hollows as he forced himself to come to a stop, he swung back round and sliced through another hollow at its waist, ignoring the pain from his back as best as he could from the motion. 1 hollow left. It turned to look at him before letting out a loud roar, its claws extending out further and becoming sharper. He swung out with his Zanpakuto to block its strike, only to find resistance hitting his blade. His blade couldn't break through its claws in his weakened state. As if sensing its advantage, the hollow forced its arm to continue its swing, sending Toshiro flying into a nearby building's wall. Everything hurt, he noticed as he slammed into the bricks. Nothing was untouched by the pain and nothing could stop it. It was all he could do to keep his hands from shaking as he raised his sword once more, the hollow swinging at him for what he assumed the hollow intended to be for the last time. That would certainly be true, but he refused to let the hollow believe that would be the cause because it had won. Pulling back as far as he could, pressing himself right back against the wall again, the claws slashed across his chest. However, that was what he knew would happen. The wounds were shallow, he tell that just from the feeling he got from them, and if he had stayed where he was then they would have done far worse. Stepping forward too would have been suicide since he doubted he could dodge at that range and strike. But now that the hollow had swung, it had opened itself right up. His sword swung through the air one final time and the hollow fell to the ground, its mask cut cleanly in half. All 12 were dead. However, as he looked back the way the hollows had come from, he felt his hopes scatter like dust. He had struggled to kill 12 weak hollows in this state and had almost died as a result. And now there was at least 100 hollows coming down that small opening. Looking around too, he could see his attempts at diverting the path of the hollows had failed. They were scaling buildings all around them, climbing over his barriers without caring that they were even there. He had hoped they wouldn't, but it seemed he was having no luck today. Toshiro. He spun round at the mayor's voice, seeing the man waving at him. He was standing in the doorway of what appeared to be the town hall, the rest of the villagers behind him, as he called out towards him. Hurry! Realizing what the mayor was after, he began to run, each step causing his body to erupt in pain. He pressed on regardless, desperately trying to reach the doorway. He could hear the hollows beginning to roar again, the sounds of them charging filling his ears, but he ignored all of that in order to keep taking each step one by one. The mayor stretched out a hand towards him and he did the same in turn, the gap slowly closing as he tried to make it. It wasn't the old man who grabbed him but one of the strong men from the village, pulling him in just as he got near. The door slammed against the door frame behind him as the villagers desperately tried to bolt it shut. And then, as if that wasn't enough, they pushed whatever large objects they could find in front of the door to barricade it. Are you all right? The mayor asked him. He just shook his head, a grimace on his face as he did his best to stay standing. He failed, slipping down and almost falling to the ground if it wasn't for the man who had pulled him in. The man carefully helped lower him down until he was resting on the floor, taking deep breaths as he placed his Zanpakuto by his side. There's too many, Toshiro muttered weakly. I can't hold them off in those numbers. We should have a bit of time, the mayor stated. This hall was built as a retreat for the village in case of the worst. It won't last for long, but it should give us some more time for help to arrive. It won't hold, Toshiro said in response. What's good to stop bandits and raiders won't stop hollows. It was why he hadn't suggested a retreat to a place like this before. Hollows would still break through easily and they could even bring down the roof of the building, killing countless villagers in the process. A place like this wasn't a haven but a tomb. Are there any ways out? The major shook his head. None. But have faith in these walls. They will hold. They won't. Oh. Despite the situation, the mayor still could show amusement, a faint smile across his face. Are you so sure? Listen. Toshiro frowned. Listen? What would that do? What would listening do? All he would hear would be the sound of hollows, tearing at the walls and he couldn't hear that. Well, that wasn't exactly true, but the noise from the hollows outside was greatly diminished. He could hear them scraping at the walls, but they had yet to break through yet. They should have done so in seconds at the very most. How? The mayor continued to smile, though it did dim slightly as the old man spoke. We had some trouble in the past. Bandits are nothing unusual in these parts, but anything else is rare. Which is why we had the misfortune to encounter a group of hollows years ago. How are you all still alive? Toshiro asked bluntly. There was no other way to put it, really. An isolated village like this would never have been able to contact mages for help in time to avoid being destroyed. Without magic, the villagers might as well have been throwing stones at the hollows. What happened? What happened indeed, the mayor muttered. Well, we got help from a retired mage in a nearby village. She saved us, though I don't know what took place in the battle itself, and freed us from the hollow threat. But I was scared. Scared something like this would happen again, especially since we were lucky to even get help in our isolated location. So I struck a deal with the Magic Council. I gave them information and they helped improve the villagers' defenses and communication lines. And, the mayor added, per my request, they also built this. It's essentially a bunker right now. A hollow could bang on those doors for weeks on end and not get through, and we have enough food stockpiled up to last us around 2 or 3 weeks minimum depending on how we ration it. There's not one hollow out there though, Toshiro pointed out, the mayor nodding as he agreed with him. Indeed. Against such a force. Well, the walls will buckle and bend before eventually shattering. They aren't meant to last against such numbers. What could hold for weeks may only last minutes. But then minutes might be all we need. You never know in situations like these. How on earth did you even get the Magic Council to give you all of this? Toshiro asked suspiciously. I doubt a bit of random info about some hollows could do that. Was there some ruins around here that had been undiscovered, belonging to an ancient civilization? Or did you have contacts that could help the Magic Council get in contact with someone? I guess the latter is the most accurate, the mayor admittedly, for once refusing to meet Toshiro's eyes. What I did was necessary, I stand by that, but it doesn't mean I'm proud of what I did. I'd rather not talk about it if that's all the same to you. Bad memories and all that. Toshiro simply nodded, no stranger to bad memories himself. All he could do then was listen. The noise from outside only grew as time began to pass, and it wasn't long before the first sign of danger showed itself. A small scream from one of the villagers near the far right wall immediately grabbed his attention, his focus shifting from the woman in question to the crack now present in the wall she stood by. After the first crack appeared, it wasn't long before more joined it. Pretty soon there were cracks covering every wall that surrounded them, the sounds of the hollows outside getting louder and louder as more sound began to seep through. Eventually the first hole appeared too, a large claw stabbing through the walls and almost impaling a nearby villager. Half the room was screaming while the brave few nearby desperately tried to block up the hole with whatever they had to hand. He wanted to join them, to help, but the mayor held him down with a weak hand, that mere fact making him realize just how little he would be able to do right now. Leave this to us, the mayor had stated, a sad smile on his face as if knowing they were almost out of time. You bought us days with your actions and then still tried to buy us more when you had nothing left to give. For these last few minutes please rely on us in exchange. The words were meant to reassure him, he assumed, but they did little to do that. He knew that if no help arrived before the hollows broke through the walls, they were all dead. Not one of them would survive against such odds, as badly equipped as they were. Finally though, the sounds stopped. Claws that had been sticking into the walls retracted while noises and screams from outside ceased. He felt himself frowning at the silence, unsure of what reason the hollows had stopped for. He could still sense the outside with his limited senses, so they hadn't been wiped out. They had just pulled back and stopped. But why? A brief spike suddenly burst to life in his senses and he immediately screamed out a warning to those around him. Get down! Every villager threw themselves to the ground at his scream, uncaring about getting a foot shoved in their face or falling face first into the hard floor. All they cared about was listening to that single warning. It came just in time as a bright crimson beam tore through the building they were hiding in, wiping out the entire top half of the building, roof, and all. If even a single villager had been standing when that beam hit, it would have taken their head clean from their shoulders, leaving no trace of it behind. What was that? He heard the mayor mutter fearfully, looking towards him for an answer. The hall should have held. That's how powerful a Zero is, Toshiro replied calmly, slowly getting to his feet as he looked around at the hollows surrounding them. You must have seen some of them hitting the barrier in the time it was up for. A Zero is a beam of pure destructive force. However, the only hollows capable of utilizing it are Minos-class hollows. If you had encountered one in the past, you wouldn't be still alive. When the Magic Council built this place, Toshiro added, I doubt they anticipated the likelihood of a Minos-class hollow appearing here. They generally don't tend to leave Hueco Mundo, and if they did leave they wouldn't go after you lot. You lot have barely anything in terms of magical power, and a Minos class hollow is going to want a good meal for the trouble it will have to endure while out of its home. It wouldn't bother with you lot if you can't even satisfy it as a snack. So this is it, the mayor muttered, getting to his feet himself as the other villages began to stand. Glancing at the ground, he slowly reached down and pulled up the makeshift weapon he had with him, holding it at the ready. His guard may have been sloppy and his technique awful, but his will still stayed strong. I don't know how many we can even kill, if we can even take down one of them at all, but I don't intend to go down screaming in fear. What say you all? No cheers sounded behind him, but not a single scream sounded either. The villagers simply grabbed their tools and weapons, accepting their death but unwilling to let it happen easily. Seeing their resolve, Toshiro readied his own blade, taking a step forward on shaking legs and positioning himself between the villagers and what he could only assume was the Minos class hollow, going by how the other hollows nearby were deferring to it. Stay behind me, he ordered them. I'll keep them back here as long as I can. I appreciate the sentiments, said the mayor with a false smile, but we're surrounded. You can only protect so many of us at once before you fall yourself. Toshiro didn't reply. He knew the mayor's words were true, but he didn't want to accept them. Gripping his sword tightly, he could only watch as the hollows all began to charge, preparing to cut down at least one of the hollows before they all overwhelmed him. The hollows all let out a roar of victory as they lunged at them, their deadly claws and teeth preparing to rip them all to shreds. Getchuga Tenshou. A sea of flames shot through the streets, slamming straight into the hollows, lunging at them from the front and burning them to a crisp. At the same time, the hollows from their south all fell apart, a man appearing for tiny moments as he moved from hollow to hollow in instantaneous moves, a scythe slicing through them with each swing. Chains burst out and pierced all the hollows coming from the west, holding them up like decorations and trophies as an old man with an eye patch began to approach them. And from the east, the hollows there were simply blown away, destroyed by zeros that only hollows could make. Or, more accurately he thought, those with hollow powers. Toshiro. I'm back. That was Karen's voice, the girl he had prayed had managed to reach safety, appearing out of the flames as they parted around her. She looked a mess, as if she had just gotten out of bed. And judging by the fact she still looked injured, bandages covering her body, she might very well have. You're lucky we made it in time, said Mest as he called out from behind them, his scythe resting against his shoulders as he eyed the hollows around them. I would have teleported to you sooner, but I had some problems dealing with a particularly bothersome hollow. I was still fighting him when the barrier went down. You were still dealing with him? The old man nearby asked, a mocking tone in his voice. No wonder I had to rush here alone. I was already done by the time the barrier fell. I have to say, kid, the old man added as he turned towards him. Very impressive work with the barrier. It's rare you find talent for these. Not enough truly appreciate good quality spells. Looks like you're alright, Squirt, he heard Shinji call out, a voice he was so glad to hear. Seems we arrived just in the nick of time, Ichigo. You're telling me, Ichigo replied, and Toshiro couldn't hide the relief he felt at his old mentor's voice. It was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders because he felt now that everything would be fine. Sorry about the barrier, Toshiro. That was my fault. Didn't realize the enemy still had one more trick up their sleeve to try and kill me. Ended up bringing this whole thing down. If I'd known, I would have rather tanked the blast instead. It's fine, he found his voice saying, the relief in it evident to even his ears. You all made it in time. Thank God. His vision faded as the relief wiped away all the tension in his body. It had taken every bit of willpower he had to keep fighting until now, and with his injuries he had been barely hanging on. With hope there before him now, he simply let all his strength fade with a smile, his body being caught by the mayor, and then immediately caught again by the other men nearby as the mayor's strength failed to hold him up for long. They were safe now, and with that he could rest happily. Protector of the fairies. It seems things are close to being over, Mist Ogden muttered to himself, briefly glancing at the village nearby before turning his full focus back to Starkey. Hollows from both the ground and the sky tried to bombard him with attacks, but his legendary spell's defenses held all of it back, the hard light only scratching under the rain of blows. What about you? Do you think the same? Starkey only shrugged, the hollow in a far worse state than he was. The hollow's arm had, at one point, been held loosely at its side, broken after one of his giant's fists had slammed into Stark. Now that the hollow's instant regeneration was back in play, the damage was gone, but the sleeve of his shirt was still ripped and the rest of his clothes weren't in any better state. He didn't know why the hollow had gotten so much weaker during their fight. Stark appeared to have had some idea but hadn't been very forthcoming with the information. As such, he had found that it had become so much easier to fight the hollow during that time. For one thing, Stark had gotten much slower. The biggest problem with his legendary spell was that it wasn't as fast as he needed at times, so this had taken away that problem entirely. The only other real danger to him would have been the Zeros, but Stark's power drop had affected that too. Every Zero he fired could damage his legendary spell, but it was only surface damage. Not one Zero managed to get more than a third of the way through his giant's body, no matter where they were fired at. Things had begun to change now though. Stark's power had returned and he now posed a legitimate threat once again. However, the damage had been done and his magical power had dropped quite significantly from having to heal all the damage he took. Well, he asked again only to find that Stark wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the village instead and all the hollows swarming in. Was he planning to go help them? He knew that some of the others had managed to make it to the center. He had recognized the magic in the distance with just a glance, so he knew the others were safe at the moment. The hollows were another matter, their forces close to extinction as the Genesis continued to fire down from above, not being the slightest bit lenient to the enemies below. "I guess I can say we did our best," Stark muttered, barely loud enough for Mistogan to hear. "Wonder Weiss was the key to this plan and Neutra is dead too. I'm the only Espada left, so no one can disprove my story. No one nearby is watching too, so." Before Mistogan could stop him, Stark created a Zero right before his chest and fired. The beam, however, rather than being aimed at Mistogan's own allies, instead cut down into the force of hollows below, destroying any caught in its grasp. Zero. 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 Stark continued to fire down at the hollows below and all around them, ignoring Mistogan's look of shock as bright blue beams continued to fill the air around them. "What are you doing?" he eventually asked, his voice finally returning to him. Stark was slaughtering his own allies en masse, uncaring of how many fell around him. And while he shouldn't feel bad about hollows dying, he couldn't stand seeing such betrayal. "Those are your allies, are they not?" "So you're a kind one," Stark commented, not stopping firing his rain of Zeros down at the ground. Mistogan knew he could force the man to stop if he went and fought him right now, but at the same time Stark killing these hollows also reduced the number of enemies left to deal with. You don't care if your enemies die, but you do hold on to the ideal that allies should not betray allies. That's an honorable thing to believe in. Neither said anything else, Mistogan simply watching as Stark finally finished firing after a bit over a minute. He was almost out of magical power and it would be so easy to kill the hollow right here and now. But he hesitated. He didn't quite know why he did so himself, but he guessed it could only be because of one reason. He didn't want to strike down someone so weak after they had just helped them so much. Under the sands, Stark finally spoke, surprising Mistogan with his words. "Under the sands, you'll find a door. There are many paths, but the only one you should take is back. Only by retreating can you find the way forward." "What?" "Tell Ichigo Kurosaka those words. Those exact words. I'll be waiting there on the day the sands of Hueco Mundo invade the barrier that surrounds your land. On that day, all of the hollows of Hueco Mundo will go to feast. All but their king, sitting on a throne of bones, for the dead do not need such sustenance." "Again, what? Why are you telling us this?" Stark didn't respond to his questions, instead clicking his fingers as the space beside him opened up, as if the sky itself had been ripped apart. "Lilynet. We're going." The only other hollow still alive nearby shot to Stark's side, one with the appearance of a child with light green hair peeking out of a horned helmet. "Whatever you do for now, I wish you the best of luck. Things have been set in motion and I don't know how to stop it. I wish I could just sleep. Like I used to." Before Mistogan could even try and say anything to that, Stark was already in the portal he had made, the space closing behind him and the other hollow. What was that? Mistogan let his legendary spell fade away as he thought over the hollow's words once again, unable to make heads or tails out of it in the hollow's previous actions. Had it been, trying to warn them? To help them? Looking around he could see no hollows left standing outside of the village, and if there were any left Hibiki would find them with his super archive. In the city their numbers were almost gone too, destroyed by those defending the villagers. The only reason this had been resolved so quickly, despite the barrier coming down, was because of that hollow, there was no doubt about that. But why had it helped them? Why? He shook his head. Whatever the reason was, he would at least pass on the message to Ichigo like the hollow had asked. He owed it at least that, which might have been its intention by wiping out the other hollows. To put him in his debt and force him to pass on the message. Once he told Ichigo he could let him worry about it. He would simply follow his orders like always and try to ignore the words of a pest in his head, even if that pest claimed he already knew the answer he sought. Protector of the fairies. The meaning behind the trap. I thought I told you to stay on the ship, Ichigo said to Karen, flicking her on the head in annoyance as they stood beside Taoshiro's unconscious body. Beside them Kisuke continued to work, applying the necessary techniques to heal Taoshiro's injuries and restore his lost magical power. Injured people should rest. I did rest. Karen said in protest, holding her forehead in pain with both hands. And then I saw the barrier fade and rushed right down as fast as I could. You think I was going to sit around and wait at a time like that? I told you it was dangerous in your condition. You could have gotten yourself killed. You would have done the same thing in my place. She's got you there, Ichigo, Kisuke spoke up, briefly taking his eyes off Taoshiro before he got back to work. Stubborn you lot are. All of you Kurosakis. I'd say it runs in the family considering your father and even your mother were the same. See? Karen replied triumphantly before wincing in pain as she grabbed her sides. All right, maybe I should go back to bed now. And stay in there until you're healed, Ichigo stated. I can get away with being stubborn because my body restores itself back to full capacity in seconds. What's your excuse? Alright already, I get it. Instead of leaving however, she crouched down beside Taoshiro, one hand reaching out towards him and brushing against his cheek. Do you mind if I stay here for a bit first though? At least until Taoshiro is moved. Go ahead, Ichigo replied softly, looking down at his old student himself. Make sure he's alright for me, would you? I want to check on the village and make sure we haven't got any stragglers running around or that we missed any hollows. Hibiki's running a skin on the ladder, Kisuke stated for his benefit. He'll let us know if there are some hiding nearby, but the city is at least clear. You can relax now for a bit. After being targeted, in what must have been a pretty dangerous trap according to Shinji, you must be tired, mentally if not physically. We're all tired after this fight anyway. Get some rest. Ichigo gave Kisuke a smile in response, but he was pretty sure the man saw through it. Sure, he lied as he began to walk away. I'll head up to the ship in a bit and get some rest. You just remember to do the same too. Rushing away as quickly as he dared before Kisuke could see through his words anymore, Ichigo found sanctuary in the crowds of villagers that he passed. They didn't know him, which meant they wouldn't see through his words like Kisuke could, and that in itself was a relief. He wouldn't be able to put this off forever though. He'd probably have to pretend to go to sleep in a bit and just look at more of Ziref's memories. If he slept there was too much chance of them bleeding through, and it was hard enough dealing with the memories when he was conscious, let alone when his mind's defenses were down. When dreaming it was so difficult to differentiate himself from Ziref in the memory, and generally he was trapped in there until the current memory ended or someone woke him up. Coming to a stop at the edge of the crowd of people, he took a seat on part of a destroyed wall, looking up at the moon for a moment as it hung overhead. He simply enjoyed the silence for a few seconds until he noticed an old man sitting down beside him, a weary look on his face. I had my doubts, you know, the old man said to him. That you would come and save us. I'm very glad you did. I can honestly only offer you my gratitude, though I fear it isn't nearly enough to repay this debt. You think we'd abandon you all after Taoshiro risked his life to keep you all safe? Ichigo scoffed. Unlikely. We wouldn't be able to abandon you all anyway, seeing this many hollows right at your doorstep. It was odd. Something about this man was familiar. It was nothing. No real reason to owe us a debt. Many would have run, the old man countered. Those odds were not ones normal people can hope to win against. But you all stayed, fought, and even won without losing a single one of you. You must all be very powerful mages, which means you must be highly sought after in this war. And yet you spent time to help us when you could have simply taken your friend and left. Indeed, if you had, I would not have held it against any of you. And most certainly not you. There it was again, Ichigo noticed. That odd feeling of familiarity. I don't see why I'm so special to you. We haven't met, have we? Ichigo frowned as he looked at the man, trying to put his face to a memory. He couldn't for the life of him remember seeing this man before, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had forgotten something. This whole place had been screaming at him that he should remember it, but he didn't. He didn't remember visiting this place once on a mission with Fairy Tail or the Magic Council, and he certainly hadn't traveled here since. And it wasn't like he had traveled much before Fairy Tail either. He had either been with Kisuke in that isolated place or at his hometown. The only other place he ever saw was... He froze. The memories flooded back, but he still sat there, uncertain of what he saw. Then he stood, his head turning from side to side as he looked once again at the details of the village that he had missed. He had thought something had been odd when he had entered this village, feeling like he had gone through those gates once before, but he had dismissed it. He had thought the layout had rung a bell, but he had assumed it was because other villages had done similar things. And he remembered a man that had led the town and had been his unofficial babysitter for the day while his mother went out to fight. "You're the mayor," Ichigo finally said, turning back to the old man as he began to sit back down. "The mayor from that village years and years ago." The old man smiled at him. It wasn't a happy smile, not by far, but it did hold a small amount of appreciation in it at being remembered. But most of it was regret. So much regret that the smile could be positively screaming it at him. "It's been a long time, Ichigo. I still remember you as that little kid, pestering me with questions about a world you probably had never experienced until that day. I was like that back then, wasn't I?" muttered Ichigo. "Should have realized it sooner, to be honest. The place has changed a lot, but it still has the same feel to it." "I like to think so too," replied the mayor before slowly bowing his head. "I'm sorry. I assume this is the reason you think you owe such a big debt to me for helping you." "It is. I don't know how much you know, but I sold out your family to the Magic Council. So that's why Dad went back there," Ichigo muttered, his voice sounding like he was talking about the weather rather than a difficult topic. "I did wonder. Well, I suppose Karen and Yuza might have wanted a life outside of military camps, but that's their problem with you, not mine. No point apologizing to me about it." "I'm aware," the mayor finally responded. "I kept up to date with the news. I expected some form of retaliation from your father, but it never came. I guess he never saw the point of it. And when he returned to active service, I read the papers about it. How he and his 2 daughters had been found safe and sound." The mayor suddenly glanced at him, the regret in his eyes now clouding any relief he might have once shown. "And no mention of a wife or a son. So that's what this is about," Ichigo stated. "It's about my mother. She was alive when she left the village," the mayor continued, almost as if unaware Ichigo had said anything. He was too lost in trying to say words he had held close to his chest for years. "And so were you. For years I agonized over the choices I had made. They were necessary decisions, I would do them again if I needed to, but I do regret them. I regretted the fact that I may very well have gotten the woman who was kind enough to help us and the son she had brought along, under the belief the mission wasn't that dangerous, killed. And then you were found," said the mayor. "For a brief moment I was so relieved when I heard about you in Fairy Tail. Then that relief turned to fear. There was still no mention of your mother, not one word, and I figured that if she wasn't going to show up now, then she never would. You may have lived, but she died. And when I realized that, I thought about you, how obvious it had been to me of your love for your mother. And I thought..." The mayor couldn't finish his sentence, the words catching in his throat. He didn't need to though, Ichigo already realizing what the mayor had thought he would have done. "You thought I would come back to kill you," he finished for the old man. You thought I would be so full of hate and despair that I would grow stronger and stronger and then finish what those hollows started. Could you blame me? The mayor asked. I was terrified of that possibility. And I knew I deserved it too. I knew that if you came to me one day, if you came demanding for my head, I would offer it up so that it could all end. Both your pain and mine. But you never did come. The old man paused at this, as if contemplating how to continue. You stayed away for years on end and never came back, not even once. You of all people had the right to abandon us today after what I did. If you had known the truth when you came to rescue us, would you have still done so? Ichigo looked at him for a moment before scowling. If you weren't so old I'd punch you for that. I'm sorry. You heard me. What kind of question is that? Just because you think I might have hated you, you think I would have abandoned you all? Don't be ridiculous. I'll say this right now. I never blamed you for my mother's death. Not even once. You didn't. Ichigo shook his head. No. For the longest time I blamed myself. I blamed myself for falling for the Hollows trap and having to have my mother save me at the cost of her own life. Then I learned that Kisuk played a role in bringing the Hollows here in the first place, and even now I know the reason my mother's powers failed her that day was because of the Quincy King that is currently waging war against us. But not once did I blame you. You weren't in on it or a part of it. I know this because Kisuk would never trust anyone with the plan he had. And if you were involved with Wiwak in any way, then you wouldn't be here. I can't blame someone who never intended for his actions to bring about someone's death when there are plenty of other candidates out there to shoulder that burden. So don't bother bringing this up again. It's in the past and we can't change that. No point worrying about it now. The old man simply looked at Ichigo for a few moments, his eyes watching him as if looking for any form of deceit in what Ichigo had said. And finally, when the old man had determined that he couldn't find any, he looked away, one hand being brought up to his eyes as he tried to hide them. From the sounds Ichigo could hear though, it sounded like he was crying. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ichigo simply nodded, knowing how it felt to finally have a burden like that taken off your shoulders. The old man had been carrying it for years on end, truly believing one day that he would be back to kill him and honestly believing that he would deserve it too. To finally be torn free of that belief, he wasn't surprised the old man was crying. He was finally free of the shadows of that past that had plagued him for so long. Remember, Ichigo said as he got up. I don't owe you a debt for saving you here. We saved you because we could, that's really all it comes down to. So you just enjoy what life you have right now and let go finally. You'll free and now you'll be safe. All of you will. Protector of the fairies. Repeat those words again for me. Under the sands, you'll find a door, repeated Miss Doggin. There are many paths but the only one you should take is back. Only by retreating can you find the way forward. Ichigo scratched his chin at the words, glancing around the table at the others. For the time being they had retreated back to the ship and Hibiki was in the process of bringing it down to the ground so that the villagers would be able to board. Mest and Shinji had offered to stay behind on the ground to keep an eye on the situation, but the conversation was still getting transmitted to them through Hibiki's archive magic. Anyone got any ideas? Asked Ichigo, looking at Kisuk and Hades in particular. The two of them tended to be the most likely to see any hidden messages in words, but they both shook their heads. Words may have meanings but the meanings cannot always be seen without context, explained Hades. These words might not reveal their meaning until the moment you need them to. However, I can reckon a guess that this is linked to Hueco Mundo in some way. It's got to be, Kisuk added himself. Sand is too vague for words like this. The only sand this hollow could be referring to is Hueco Mundo, though that doesn't quite narrow the scope of this area down. Hueco Mundo is a large place and it could take decades to search under the sand for a single clue. As for the rest, all I can gather is that it is trying to say that you sometimes need to take a step back to see the way forward. That you shouldn't rush blindly ahead but must instead look again and consider your options. What about the rest, Miss Doggin? Nozomi asked. You said you heard more. Miss Doggin nodded. The hollow also said I'll be waiting there on the day the sands of Hueco Mundo invade the barrier that surrounds your land. On that day, all of the hollows of Hueco Mundo will go to feast. All but their king, sitting on a throne of bones, for the dead do not need such sustenance. So the hollow wants to meet, does it? Came Shinji's voice. And on the day sand from Hueco Mundo invades the barrier. That means the barrier would be broken, would it not? Undoubtedly, came Mavis's voice. We all know it's possible to break the barrier. Emperor Spriggan has done so once already, at the cost of most of his fleet, and the zombie girl Giselle likely would have with those dragon corpses she obtained. Even Ziref could have used Acknowledge if he wanted to brute force his way through. It wouldn't surprise me if Baragan has been preparing a method himself. It would explain why he has been so quiet this past month. It's just a matter of timing. So we should assume this hollow wants to meet Ichigo when this occurs, stated Kisuk seriously. Could be a trap. Could not be. Either way, this hollow is giving us an invitation that it wants us to take. We can conclude that. Whether we take it or not is another matter entirely. What is more pressing is the next line. About the hollows going to feast? Asked Mest. That sounds like my time a bit. Hollows had more freedom in the future because, apart from the other armies, resistance from us was all but gone. Resistance was present, but it wasn't uncommon for the hollows to come and have a small snack. They'd come in mass too, so even the strong groups tended to lose one or two people if they weren't careful. It said all of them though, pointed out Nozomi. In other words, it means the whole army would be marching forward, potentially even any reserves left at their own base. An all-or-nothing push that could actually work for them so long as Ichigo's not there, she finished, pausing momentarily as she made the realization. If Ichigo went there and utilized his full power, he could stop the assault in its tracks. The enemy might want to avoid that, hence this message. But look at it another way, countered Hades. It can easily mean that Baragan himself does not care for the lives of his own men. He might very well be sending them to their deaths in the hopes of buying time for some other plan. And equally, it also carries an interesting meaning. If all the hollows have gone to war, it means the king is unguarded, left to his own devices. The line bothers me though, Hades continued. Sitting on a throne of bones. It's an odd line. Does it mean that the king has come to power through sacrifice and the death of his enemies and allies? It could stand for those that have fallen to bring him this far. However, the rest about not needing food. I see what you mean, agreed Kisuk. Hollows generally are after magical power when they eat things. They target those with more power because they give them more energy. But Baragan is Nukan. He draws in energy from around himself, which may be the meaning of this line. However, it could mean something else. The line says, the dead do not need such sustenance. Is that a reference to hollows being born through the death of their old self as a human? No, it's unlikely, else it would refer to all hollows here. But this line is meant to refer to Baragan alone. Why? All the hollows may be sent to their deaths if they charge and Ichigo unleashes something like that attack he used against Acknowledge, said Hibiki. What was it called? Mutsu. Mujutsu. Ah. Now if Baragan stayed at home and let this all happen, that in itself could be a reference to the throne of bones. All his followers would be dying. Can't offer much on the line about him being dead. Maybe it's mental, Nozomi offered. He could be called dead because his reasons for living simply don't exist. He could be empty, as close to death as one can be without actually dying. And that could be why he might willingly throw away his army. When one thinks they have nothing, they can throw away what little they do have as its significance is lost to them. I think the big question here is whether the message is meant to be to help us or help them. Turning to Miss Doggen, Ichigo asked, this hollow, who gave it to you? Did they have a name? Miss Doggen nodded. Coyote Starkey. He had a pretty lazy personality from what I could see. Appearance-wise, wavy brown hair, stubble, clothes similar to most Arrancar. Kid with him. Kid. Miss Doggen frowned. There was one. A girl with green hair. Definitely an Arrancar too, though I haven't ever seen an Arrancar that young. Why? Because I met these two hollows, Ichigo replied, leaning back in his chair as he remembered the event that he met the hollows at the Grand Magic Games on the 4th day, I think it was. I remember walking out of the area, talking to my dad at the time, and I met him and the kid. She asked for my autograph at the time before mentioning Baragan. I spoke briefly with the two of them, and the next time I saw Stark, he was by Baragan's side when he declared war on us. Frowning slightly, Ichigo leaned back in as he remembered what he had seen that day. And he didn't look like he had already met me at that time either. His expression was different. Guarded even. You think he wasn't meant to meet us at the Grand Magic Games, Mavis concluded for him. It's pretty obvious he must have been there to spy on you, that's why the Quincy were there, but what spy makes contact with its quarry in such a way? He must have realized the risk it was taking. And bringing a kid with him, he must have known Ichigo could have taken her hostage or even killed her at worst. But they approached us. Did they predict your character, Ichigo? Or did they have reason to in order to make you think? He sounds like he wants to turn coat, Uriah finally said, standing at the corner of the room where he had been from the start. Gray, you are like in me in that regard. Someone deep in the enemy's midst, attempting to break free or bring about harm to them. Would you agree with my interpretation on this? Gray shrugged. Honestly? I don't know. The place I was in didn't really have people who even considered that except for me, and that was only because I still retained my memories as Gray rather than Deliara. But I guess if he's trying to reach out, it is what I tried to do when I spoke to Natsu. Leave clues in words, hint at things by pretending to play the role. Maybe he is doing the same. Exactly. If Baragan has noticed that, however, we may be in trouble, as he could just as easily turn a trap for him into a trap for us if we are unaware that he now knows. How well Stark has played this game would also determine the worth of this information. We also have to ask ourselves what goal he even seeks. A hollow betraying its own kind? For those who would kill him given the chance? There has to be a big prize to appeal to such a person. I'm not sure that's the case, Miss Doggan countered. I fought him and, while he could get serious, he generally just wanted to relax and take it easy. Even sleep. Turning to Kisuk, he asked, how old do hollows live for? Is there a limit? Kisuk shook his head. None that I am aware of, so long as they keep eating. A hollow could potentially live off a tiny amount of magic, but doing so tends to diminish its strength and size considerably. But so long as they had that at the very least, they could essentially live forever, or as close to that as you can get. For a hollow as strong as the one you described, you said he didn't use his resurrection. Yes. Then he must be a Vastolord. It takes a long time to reach that stage. I'm pretty sure Baragan is the quickest to ever achieve such power, and that may be his Ukin power at play, but for every other hollow it can take decades, normally even centuries. So if we assume Stark is very old, it's possible he was also around before Baragan became a hollow. He may very well have lived in Hueco Mundo during what we can probably call the Quiet Years, the years before Baragan took over and began uniting them all into an army. He wants a return to those days, muttered Hades. I don't generally like moving backwards, but during chaos people do tend to seek what they know can comfort them. The past is a nice place for dreams to rest at during uncertainty. If we help him, we may very well never see him again as he vanishes back into the desert of Hueco Mundo, to live out his life in the empty sands. I guess we'll have to make a decision on this closer to the time, Ichigo stated. Right now we know far too little, and, as Hades said early, more may become clear in time as we reach the events mentioned. Suppose that's for the best, muttered Uriah before speaking up. You said you had your concerns about the village. That caught everyone's attention. Until now all of the talk had been about speculation. About the meanings behind the words left behind by Stark, all for the distant future. But the village itself was a matter of the here and now, and they would be loading the villagers on board the ship soon. Realizing he had all their attention, Ichigo spoke. I know this village, he said simply. Years ago. Kisuk, you know it too. Yes, Kisuk replied regretfully. This is where I tried to orchestrate the death of Masaka Kurosake, Ichigo's mother, and the abduction of Ichigo himself. I failed, but not far from the village Masaka still died by the hands of Waiwak when he stole her powers. This place isn't just personal to you, came Shinji's voice. It's practically where you began. This is where you took your first steps down this path from. The place linked to your mother's dead. That's why I'm concerned, stated Ichigo. This place. Maybe it's a coincidence. And I would love for it to be so. But this place was also a trap that used Karen as the messenger and Toshiro as the bait. This trap was Baragan's and there is a chance it may not be over. But of course there is always another possibility. Because one other person knew about this place. Whack, Uriah stated. He never mentioned anything about this place though. I figured I would have been at least heard mention of it in some plan if it was to be used, unless of course he wanted to play this, like quite a few of his plans, very close to the chest. He may have deemed that no one but himself could be trusted with such knowledge, not even those he trusts the most, and so he could indeed have plans involving this place and you. You really think he would? Asked Nozomi, Uriah nodding after a few moments of consideration. Possibly. Whack wants Ichigo, just like he wants me. The two of us are as close to sons as he'll ever have. I doubt he is the type to bother with raising a family, and we also possess part of his own power. That's why he's trying to recruit Ichigo. But I'm resisting his efforts, pointed out Ichigo. Which means you're on the right lines. If he can't recruit you as you are, he may decide to take things back to where they started. If this is your origin, this place has more significance to you than anyone else. It is here, more than any place, where you could be broken down and molded back into something new. That may very well be Waiwaka's aim. Glancing around the room and seeing how serious and worried everyone was looking, Uriah shrugged. It could equally well be nothing at all. Could be a mere coincidence. We are looking for traps because we just experienced one and aren't sure if it's all over. This may just be us all being paranoid. Nothing more. The room fell silent, everyone considering what they had heard. No one could completely shake off the feelings of worry nor convince themselves that the situation was indeed intentional. For everything that pointed one way, something else would point back with the same level of force. We need time, Kisuke finally stated. If this was a trap that required us just to be here, it would have been triggered by now. But it hasn't been. We can assume that it's safe right now, but we are only staying here long enough to evacuate the villagers. What if that is the trap? You think the villagers are in on it? Demanded Gray. Look at them. They couldn't harm us even if they tried, you know that. Exactly. They are weak. Also weak. And how lucky it was Toshiro and Karen found them in time, being so far away. They've been saved, and now they will be evacuated and brought into the barrier. But if just a single one of them wasn't exactly what they seem to be, we have a major problem. And so what? We don't let them on. I'm not saying we don't. I'm saying we take a bit of time and look at things more closely. Make up some excuse, say the battle overheated the engines and it will take time to repair them. If they try and call our bluff, just talk and mention a lot of technical terms. I don't mean to insult the intelligence of the people living out here, but this is beyond cutting-edge tech. They wouldn't understand a fraction of it even if they tried. The people who worked on it likely barely understand it. We just need to buy ourselves a few hours to a day or two to work out if this truly is a trap or not. You may not have to create a reason, stated Hibiki, looking at an urgent message that had popped up for him. Emperor Spriggan has made a move again. His forces are attacking in mass, both with airships and some of his elite mages, and an urgent request is being made for assistance. They are avoiding requesting Ichigo himself, but the situation does at least require the Genesis's firepower. So we have some time, Mest stated. How many of us can we spare? This position is safe for now, but who knows what the situation will evolve into in the future. Who will stay? I will, Ichigo said almost immediately, the others turning to look at him in shock. Hibiki, you said yourself that they aren't requesting me. Which means they aren't expecting me to be there, and they know I won't dare make a move unless the situation was dire anyway. And with me here, we can reduce the number of people we need to leave behind. I'll stay too then, stated Kisuke. I'm suspicious enough at everything to see plots exposing. With me I'll pick up on what you miss. The rest of you go, you'll need the firepower, but give me Toshiro and Karen. Kisuke. We need a few people here at least, but we can't spare too many from our main force. It'll be suspicious. I can get away with not fighting, and so can Karen and Toshiro. They haven't been seen in a month in the first place. They are healing fine too, so they will be fine to help us here if need be. 4 in total, Hibiki muttered. Yes, that should work. The villagers know Toshiro and Karen anyway, that will help relieve them. We came back for Toshiro once before and we'll do so again, that is what they will see. It'll calm some of the panic they will feel when the Genesis leaves without them. We better get this set up quick then, Ichigo replied as they all began getting to their feet. They need you at the West battlefield. Best of luck to you all. Protector of the Fairies. How fascinating, Ziraf spoke, his voice holding the faintest trickle of interest in it. It didn't tend to care for much in relation to the abomination if it couldn't be used to cause him pain or suffering, but this was too curious to not take note of. After all, how could he not? The Genesis, the home base of the abomination and his little group of followers, was outside of the barrier. And yet not, apparently, engaging in a battle with something of seeable significance. His base had real purpose to assault. It was clear even from a distance. But according to Wall's clone, the battle was over a village. A tiny, insignificant little village besieged by hollows. Was Baragan making a push elsewhere? Was this an important part of his operation and thus the abomination had gone to try and stop it? It definitely wasn't a sanctioned mission though. Wall had given account of the number of hollows and apparently there had been no rune knights in sight. How unusual. And yet also so inviting. He just had to know what was so important about this place that the abomination would go so far to protect it. It was why he had ordered the assault on the west side of the barrier to increase drastically. He knew he was risking a lot, using up more of his precious supply of ships, but sacrifices have to be made sometimes. Plus on the ground some of the members of his Spriggan 12 would be sure to keep a lot of the big threats occupied. He knew they would be calling for the help of the Genesis right about now. Doing so would pull the abomination away from the village, and even if he left some of his friends behind they would still be in a tight spot, perfect for him to crush. Of course he couldn't very well attack outright as Spriggan. Spriggan's attack right now was not meant to be related in any way. It was merely coincidence. Ziraf meanwhile, well, he hadn't been seen in quite a while. It was pretty easy for many to assume he had been running around no man's land and preparing for a new method of attack. Now would be the perfect time to do that. And he knew just which demons would be perfect to help. They may have failed him before, but he supposed now would be a good time to see if one or two were worthy again of believing in. It helped that they would be jumping at the chance to gain his favor back, so much so they wouldn't even dare waste any time in following their orders. Yes, this will do indeed, he said, speaking softly to himself. Let me see what is so precious to you that you would sneak away to protect it. I want to see the look on your face when I grind it into dust. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.